We're now going to spend the rest of these lectures giving an overview of principal objections to the Messiahship of Jesus Yeshua based on the New Testament and then based on traditional Judaism. Now, I have over 600 pages of material in this, roughly, in volumes 4 and 5 of Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus. And if you want to get the full depth, just like for any of the subjects we covered, dive into the books, you get the information there. But we're going to tackle the principal, the most important ones, the largest ones, but we'll try to do it more concisely, and then you can dig more deeply in your further studies in Volume 4 and Volume 5. Jewish objections to the New Testament can be broken down into several categories. The New Testament misquotes and misinterprets the Hebrew Scriptures, at times manufacturing verses to suit its purposes. The genealogies of Jesus given by Matthew and Luke are hopelessly contradictory at best and entirely irrelevant anyway. The New Testament is filled with historical and factual errors, especially Stephen's speech. The teachings of Jesus are impossible, dangerous, and un-Jewish. And Jesus as a person was not so great either. The New Testament is even self-contradictory, if you want to put it bluntly. Only a fool would believe in the divine inspiration of the New Testament. So let's start with this accusation that the New Testament misquotes and misinterprets the Old Testament. At times it manufactures verses to suit its purposes. Here's the answer. No truth whatsoever to this claim. First, remember that the New Testament authors were Jews, with the probable exception of Luke, and they were sometimes writing to Jewish readers who knew their scriptures well. So to manufacture, misquote, or misinterpret verses from the Tanakh would be absolutely self-defeating. You see, they didn't just, in 30 seconds, just write down Gospel of Matthew, write down. No. This was the process, the project of years of work, and compilation, and meditation, and checking sources, and putting things together. So it's not just, hey, let's just trick everybody. Plus, they wanted people to study. They wanted people to dig. They wanted people to go further. So to manufacture a verse or to rip it completely out of context, it wouldn't take long for someone to figure out. So, yeah, well, we did figure it out. That's why we rejected it. Well, that's a little bit of a superficial approach for obvious reasons. The fact is, these authors spent much time meditating on the Tanakh. And you'd be amazed to see just how insightful their quotations and interpretations are, not to mention how much they're in keeping with the ancient Jewish methods of scriptural hermeneutics. Now, just some stats for you, all right? The New Testament is roughly 8,000 verses. Some scholars claim that almost 1 in 3, about 2,500 out of 8,000, contain an Old Testament quote or a general allusion. And you can show solidly that more than 10% of the New Testament text is made up of citation or direct allusions to the Old Testament. You can show solidly more than 10%, a direct quotation, citing the Hebrew Scriptures to make a point, more than 10%. The book of Revelation contains 404 verses. As many as 331 of those verses are drawn from the imagery of the Hebrew Scriptures. It only quotes one verse directly, that's from Psalm 2. And yet, over 300 verses, perhaps as many as 331 out of 404, are taken from imagery of the Hebrew Scriptures. I just want you to understand how deeply enmeshed this is. A New Testament and Judaic literature scholar Craig Evans summarized the situation well. The theology of the New Testament is fundamentally indebted to and a reflection of major Old Testament themes, images, and languages. There is simply no significant element in New Testament theology that is not in some way a development of a tradition or theology expressed in the sacred writings that eventually came to be what Christians call the Old Testament, Jews call the Tanakh, and scholars call the Hebrew Bible. In other words, this is a simple continuation of here's what the Hebrew Scripture said. Now they continue their development in this revelation of Jesus Yeshua, the Jewish Messiah, and bring this message not only to the Jews but to the nations as well. And as I said in the previous lecture, some scholars have analyzed, Robert H. Gundry being the best known one who wrote a particular study on this, but scholars have analyzed, let's see how Matthew cites and uses the Hebrew Scriptures. Now let's see how the Talmudic writings do, the principal rabbinic writings, Midrashic writings, others, Talmud in particular. And now let's see how the Jewish authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls quoted from the Hebrew Scriptures. And what they found was that the one who quoted in the best context and who seemed to have the best interpretive grasp of the meaning of the verses in context was Matthew, who was the least prone to just pull them out of context and out of meaning. Professor Joseph Fitzmyer, authority in the Dead Sea Scrolls and early Jewish literature, also a New Testament scholar, he said no less than the Qumran authors, Dead Sea Scroll authors, the New Testament writers considered their history to be guided by the hand of God, but for the New Testament authors, his words spoken through the prophets and writers of the Old Testament had already seen fulfillment in the new events and situations of the early Christian history. Due to the predominantly backward glance of the New Testament writers, which we have already noted, the number of such modernized texts in the New Testament is considerably greater. In other words, looking back and saying, oh, this happened to Israel, now it's fulfilled here in the Messiah, it's finding many, many, many such references. Again, I get into great detail in this in Volume 4. Now here's what's fascinating. If you look through Talmudic tractates that make ample reference to the Hebrew Scriptures, some refer to the Hebrew Scriptures more than others, some quote Tanakh more than others. If you look at the ones that quote from Tanakh the most, you'll see that sometimes it's a literal quotation. This is what the verse meant in context. This is how it's being used by the rabbinic writers. Sometimes you'll find it's used homiletically, just a point or a play on words, or even mnemonically to help you remember certain things by a certain particular text. Sometimes it's completely wrenched out of its context and quoted in a way that it's an impossible meaning. It can't possibly mean that. These are all the different ways that verses are quoted. The New Testament uses several of those ways, but it never takes a verse in such a way that's impossible to the original context. Sometimes it's literal. Hey, this is what the prophet said. Look, it's how it's coming to pass. Sometimes it's homiletical. It's a play on words. Sometimes it's there to kind of beautify the text, to bring a poetic illusion. This would have been very much in keeping with Jewish interpretation at the time of Yeshua and in the centuries that followed. So in other words, read the New Testament as a Jewish book, and a lot of the so-called problems go away. And those things that are meant to be literal fulfillment, take as literal fulfillment. And those things that are meant to be midrashic or homiletic, take as midrashic and homiletic. I hope you're following me here. Orthodox Jewish journalist and author David Klinghoffer said this about Matthew and how Matthew quotes from the Hebrew Scriptures. He said, pointing out the imprecision of proof texts like these, one feels almost unsporting. It's too easy. Yet it is with these that the New Testament begins its first attempt at narration of the life of the Christian Messiah. Whoever the first educated Jews were to have these prophetic verses cited to them, whether in Jesus' lifetime or later, they could have reacted only with puzzlement and disbelief. As the song says, is that all there is? Matthew, you gotta be kidding me. These are your proofs? This is your big book? This is the good news? We're supposed to believe in Jesus because you wrote this? Are you kidding me? Now here's something interesting. W.D. Davies collaborated with Dale C. Allison, two prominent New Testament scholars and scholars of early Jewish literature. They wrote together a 3-volume series, Dale Allison doing the bulk of the work ultimately, 3-volume series on Matthew in the International Critical Commentary. You want to talk about detailed, you want to assume that in reading it you understand Greek, you understand Latin, you understand Hebrew, you understand Aramaic, you understand German, you understand French. I mean, it's detailed, it's scholarly, it's expecting its readers to be academic. These men spent decades pouring through the text of Matthew, pouring through the commentaries, pouring through the related literature, pouring into the text in its original Greek, writing a commentary of several thousand pages on Matthew. Look at what they said. David Klinghoffer said, yeah, I mean, the way Matthew quotes things, yikes, shooting fish in a barrel, of course that's wrong, not what it means, misinterpretation, misquote. I almost feel unsporting showing how wrong it is. Listen to what Davies and Allison said, having devoted decades to the intensive academic study of Matthew. Matthew was not above scattering items in his Greek text whose deeper meaning could only be appreciated by those with a knowledge of Hebrew. Indeed, it might even be that Matthew found authorial delight in hiding bonus points for those willing and able to look a little beneath the gospel's surface. Did you get that? Did you follow that? They're saying that Matthew enjoyed making things so rich that if you really understood Hebrew and could see what he was doing, quoting the Hebrew scriptures and putting them in Greek a certain way, like, oh, that's what he meant. And maybe even that he hid things to see if you dig deep enough, you'll come up with the answer. You know what it reminds me of? I often use this illustration. Let's say some student comes up to you, you're teaching physics, some student comes up to you and says, "Professor, I've made a discovery that's going to change the face of science in this century. I've made perhaps the most revolutionary discovery of all time. And I'd like to share that with you." Professor says, "Oh, you have? Really? Great. Let's hear it." E equals mc squared. That's your brilliant discovery. Yeah. E equals mc squared. Now, someone who doesn't understand physics, the theory of relativity, the whole bit, would hear that and say, "What? Oh, yeah, one of the greatest scientific discoveries in the history of mankind, something that's going to change the entire century and change the face of science," and so on and so forth. E equals mc squared. Oh, yeah, right, sure. Brilliant. But in point of fact, it was brilliant. In point of fact, it was revolutionary. As simple as it is, for those who understand it, profound. Well, these authors are saying that what Matthew says, it may look simple, and you may think there's nothing to it, and you may do what David Klinghoffer does, says, "Matthew, come on, you can do better than that." They said, no, dig deeper. It's more profound than that. Dig deeper, and you will discover. So let me give you an example of an alleged manufacturing of a verse by Matthew, okay? An alleged manufacturing of a verse. Matthew chapter 2. End of Matthew chapter 2 says something very, very interesting. Here we go. We'll start in verse 19. "But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, 'Rise, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel. For those who sought the child's life were dead.' And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judah in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled. He shall be called a Nazarene." And there I've got quotes in my Bible. He shall be called a Nazarene. That's what the prophet spoke. There's only one problem. There's no such prophecy. Prophets never said that. Matthew made it up. Okay. First, for what purpose? If he's trying to help Jewish followers of Jesus grow in their faith and be strengthened in the faith, and if he's trying to reach Jewish people in his community that don't believe in Yeshua, what's the purpose of manufacturing something that everybody knows was manufactured? Well, you see, a lot of people didn't have Bibles then, and a lot of people couldn't check. Yeah, but there are others who had the text basically memorized. Because things were passed on orally and there was so much study that was done, you don't manufacture a verse to here, I'm in a court of law, and I'm arguing for my client. And I say, if you will look in the statute of 1956, the court and the ruling of this versus this, they said, and I make the thing up. Well, someone's going to say, well, where is that? That's a great point you made, but where is it? And he didn't have to say anything. In other words, he just could have said he came to Nazareth. End of subject. Not everything has to be a prophecy. Not everything has to be foretold in advance. So just leave it. Don't make something up that doesn't exist. So the idea that he would make something up is so outlandish, so self-defeating, so illogical that we need to say, okay, what's he actually saying? Now, we're going to step back and we're going to work our way through these early chapters of Matthew, all right? We see first, he presents this as the book of the genealogy of Yeshua the Messiah. the son of David, the son of Abraham, and he goes from there. We'll look more at the genealogy later, but he divides it into 3 14s, in one counting two different ways. He divides it into 3 groups of 14, perhaps because David in Hebrew, David, Dalet Vav Dalet, equals 14. 4 plus 6 plus 4 equals 14. So his name, perhaps symbolizing 14, son of David, Messiah. Could be. Or it could just be it was divided like that to help people memorize 14, 14, 14. Then he quotes from Isaiah chapter 7. The miraculous birth of Yeshua fulfills what Isaiah prophesied, that just a young maiden will have this glorious birth, apparently birth of supernatural import. Her child will be called Emmanuel. We looked at that in some depth earlier and saw that Matthew is looking at Isaiah 7, 9, and 11, which we'll come back to. We'll see why I say that. He's looking at 7, 9, and 11 at this larger context and realize this is a prophecy to godless Achaz, to the house of David. It's a prophecy about a king that's going to be born. Therefore, whatever happened in that day is just a foreshadowing of a greater fulfillment of a Messianic king. That's all he's saying. And by the way, this is the only time this verse is quoted in the New Testament. People say it's the central prophecy. It's just quote it one time. And it's based on seeing a fuller meaning in Isaiah 7 through 11. Then Messiah's birth prophesied in Micah, the 5th chapter. This is where David came from, his origins in Bethlehem, so also the Messiah. Either saying his origins go all the way back to that or saying they're pre-existent. And we know that rabbinic interpretation says that the Messiah is pre-existent or his name is pre-existent. So that would be in keeping with some rabbinic thought. Matthew quotes Micah 5, "You, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, by no means least among the rulers of Judah." The Hebrew says, "You are the least, but nonetheless from you, the ruler will come." Either Matthew is understanding the Hebrew lamed as low, not, so you're not the least, or he's simply, in a Targumic paraphrastic interpretation, saying it says you're the least, but actually you're not because the Messiah comes through. But he's quoting here, alluding to Micah chapter 5. Now, Yeshua goes into Egypt. Before that, goes into Egypt as God's son, so that what the prophet said can be fulfilled. Out of Egypt I called my son. So just as Israel in its infancy went into Egypt, we looked at this earlier, Hosea 11:1. Matthew wants to see the whole verse, not just the snippet he quotes, but the whole verse. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and I called my son out of Egypt. So it goes back to Israel's history. It's now recapitulated in the Messiah, who goes into Egypt as a child, God's son, just like Israel was, and then is called up out of Egypt. Then, as there's the slaughter of the baby boys in Bethlehem, Jeremiah hears Rachel weeping again from Jeremiah. Matthew hears Rachel weeping again from Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in loud lamentation. Rachel, weeping for her children, refused to be comforted because they are no more. Well, Jeremiah heard her weeping poetically. Now Matthew does as well. This is, once again her voice is raised. These words are fulfilled. Once again she weeps and cries. She's in fact wept and cried many times for her children. It was talking initially about going into exile, and it says in Jeremiah, your children will return home. Here he's just hearing poetically. This is a midrashic interpretation. And then we have, he shall be called a Nazarene. When we move on from here, we see that John the Immerser is the forerunner of the Lord. There is a new exodus, Isaiah 40, a new and greater exodus, the deliverance of the captives, the exiles. And Yeshua comes according to Matthew, the 4th chapter, his coming and shining light in these places in Galilee. Now, that's what Isaiah spoke of. So we see the end of Isaiah 8, beginning of Isaiah 9. Matthew's looking at that. The land of Zebulun. We're in Matthew 4, the land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, by the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light. So as Isaiah spoke then of his day, now we see its fulfillment through Yeshua. We also see that Yeshua is baptized at the Jordan. The children of Israel, of course, passed through. They passed through the Red Sea, then they crossed the Jordan. We see that Yeshua was tempted for 40 days in the wilderness, just as the the children of Israel were tempted and tested for 40 years. He's 40 days in the wilderness. They're 40 years in the wilderness. He combats Satan, how? With 3 quotations from the book of Deuteronomy, the wilderness wanderings book. He combats Satan in the wilderness with 3 quotations from Deuteronomy. And then Matthew 5, he sees the crowds. What does he do? He goes up on the mountain, think Mount Sinai. Now he teaches Torah. The word of the Lord, the Torah of the Lord coming from Mount Sinai. So Matthew's looking at this as just very, very much messianic, very much all pointing towards King Messiah. Messiah Yeshua recapitulates what Israel did and now brings it to its full meaning. So what do we do with Matthew 2:23? And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, that was spoken, what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled. He shall be called a Nazarene. The first thing is Matthew uses a different term here than anywhere else. The way he puts it in Greek is different, and it's what was spoken by the prophets, plural. So this is not just a quote from one. This is what the prophets, plural, said. He shall be called a Nazarene. Nazarene, he lives in Nazareth. What's he talking about? Well, there's several things. First, Isaiah chapter 11, and there are many, many Jewish scholars believe this and hold to this is what was in Matthew's mind. And you'll see it's not just this one passage. Look at this. Isaiah 11:1. V'yatzah choter migeza yishai. A shoot will come forth from the stock of Jesse. V'netzer mishorashav yifra. And a branch will spring from its roots. Netzer, the Messiah. This is a clear Messianic prophecy. Rabbis, counter-missionaries agree on that. Isaiah 11, a netzer, he'll be a netzer. And he lives in Nazareth. He lives in Nazareth. Oh, isn't that interesting? And he's called the netzer. But hang on. Matthew says the prophets said this. Well, what's interesting is that his lowliness is spoken of, which would also tie in a place like Nazareth. But the prophets also called him Jeremiah 23, and then Zechariah 3, Zechariah 6. They used another name for netzer, branch, tzemach. Could it be that Isaiah, Jeremiah, all prophesying about the same one, the netzer, tzemach, the branch, this branch that springs forth from the root of Jesse, this Messianic king? Could it be that Matthew is looking at these passages and it's prophesied that he's going to be called a netzer, he's going to be called a branch? So the prophets spoke this, and Isaiah in particular used the word netzer, which is then a play on words of the name Nazareth, Natzrat or Natseret. That would be one of those things that Davies and Allison were talking about, saying, see, Matthew's saying, dig a little deeper, and you'll understand what I'm talking about. And in fact, the prophets did call him the branch, which does speak of lowliness. And the prophets did refer to him, here Isaiah, as not just tzemach, but netzer. And here he lives in the city of Nazareth, and Matthew looks almost with a smile and a wink and says, that's what the prophets spoke. You see, if you're going to look at this as, well, scientific, see, it says this, and here, that's not how it's being used for the most part. This is understood as God's holy word, proclaiming these things often in mysteries. And now these mysteries are being opened up for us. That's why the psalmist prays in Psalm 119, Gal einai ve'abita niflaot mitortecha. Uncover my eyes, open my eyes, that I might behold wonders from your law. That rabbinic interpretation says that each verse of Torah is 70 different understandings and interpretations. We don't have to get into all that to believe that this word is very rich, and Matthew's unfolding it, having seen the Messiah, having watched his miracles, having seen him die, having seen him rise, having seen him ascend to heaven, and continue his miracles through him. Now he's looking back at the scriptures and says, look at this. This is amazing. It opens up for us. All right, we're going to continue looking at some of the principal Jewish objections to the Messiahship of Jesus Yeshua based on the New Testament. But I wanted to look at a few of these things in more depth to give you an understanding of how we refute these objections. And it's often in a very Jewish way that we refute the Jewish objection. We are going to continue looking at Jewish objections to the Messiahship of Jesus Yeshua based on the New Testament. We've looked at a few things with Messianic prophecy, like Psalm 40 as it's quoted in the New Testament, or Psalm 22 as it's translated in many Christian translations. We've looked at those, but we want to focus on a few other issues with objections to the New Testament. Let's look at Matthew chapter 27. This is a really interesting one. Matthew 27, verses 9 and 10. We're told that Matthew's totally confused here. First, he quotes part of a prophecy from Zechariah. Then he says it comes from Jeremiah. Then he takes the whole thing totally out of context. How can you possibly believe in the inspiration of the New Testament, or that Matthew was writing accurately with something this botched and garbled? Now, I haven't done a lot of personal reflecting in this class. I wanted to cover as much territory within the text as possible, but I just want to pause and tell you what happened when I was working on this. I compiled my list of principal objections and then worked on writing what was ultimately a 5-volume series. Originally it was going to be 1 volume. We realized it was going to take 3. The 3 became 4. The 4 became 5. And I gathered the principal objections I heard from rabbis, from counter-missionaries, in counter-missionary books, tapes, literature. Things were not on internet as much then, but the internet's repeated most of the major objections and issues. I put them together, put my list together, and then began to work on the content. Volume 1, which contained general and historical objections, the one that I wrote last was not the last objection. It was the question of the Holocaust. I remember thinking, why did I even say that was going to be on the list? I mean, I send it into the publisher, it's on the list, it's going to be in the table of contents. Why did I even have to deal with the Holocaust? I mean, that's a Jewish objection to God or questions about God. Why do I have to even deal with that? But I had to, because of the association of the Holocaust with European anti-Semitism and European Christianity and so on. So I had to deal with it. I remember I thought, whatever I write, I'm damned if I do, I'm damned if I don't. I mean, whatever answer I come up with. And I struggled, and then God began to give me insight. And just that section of the book has been taken out. Jews for Jesus used it with our permission when they did a special Passover outreach, and they had testimonies of Holocaust survivors who believe in Yeshua today, Jewish Holocaust survivors who believe in Jesus. And they sent out those videos then, it was videos back then, sent out those videos along with a mini book. It was translated into German, just that section to be distributed in German. I felt God really gave me insights. Well, as I was working on volume 4, I really struggled with Matthew 27 because I said, I don't want to give a cheap answer. I've thought about it. I've never really dug that deep and studied it with great intensity, but the little I've looked at it, and the objections, the responses to them, the commentaries. Now, I haven't spent days and weeks and months, but the hours I've looked at it, I just haven't been satisfied with the answers. And it was troubling me because I don't like cheap answers. And even if I have solid, clear, definite evidence for 99 out of 100 things, if there's that one that's there, it bothers me. And I would rather let it sit and bother me until I get the true answer than just come up with a superficial thing and stick a Band-Aid on it. That's why some things I've read over the years, some scholar, some critic would attack something in Scripture. It had nothing to do with Jewishness, and I'd read it and look at it. It's like, that's a strong objection. I'm not sure of the answer. I'm not sure what the answer is. Let me think about it. Oh, I know Jesus is real. I know Yeshua is real. I know God's real. I know the Scriptures are true. I know my experience with God is real, but that's a good question. Let me think about it. And then it may be months later, it comes to me. I may study it for months. It may be years later. It's like, that's it. There's your answer. So I was working on this passage, and I wasn't happy with my understanding of it. And that particular night, I had a sleepless night. Now, you have to understand, I've been following the Lord as of this recording over 41 years. And I don't struggle with doubt. I don't struggle with doubt as to the existence of God. I don't struggle with doubt in terms of the Bible being God's Word. I don't struggle with doubt in terms of God's faithfulness and goodness. If I pray and cry out and don't see an answer, if I pray and cry out for something critical and don't see an answer, it may be painful, but I just have faith. I don't question. I don't question whether Jesus is the Messiah, whether Jewish people will ultimately turn and Romans 11:26 be fulfilled. I don't question that. I'm quite confident about it. I'm sure about it. Oh, I have testing and challenges and pressure and battles, and sometimes it's very intense, sure. But I don't get challenged a lot in terms of faith. Over the 41 years, there have been just a few times where it was overwhelming, this assault on my faith, and you're just supporting it. It's not true. You're just making it work. And whether it's an attack on, you've never seen God really move. You've never seen God really work. You can't possibly say this is Messianic. You can't possibly say it's about Jesus. Whatever the attack was, there have been a few of them very intense. And I've earnestly cried out to God in the midst of it. And I've gotten answers. The answers have actually strengthened my faith thereafter. I came through stronger than I was before. Well, this was one of those nights. This was one of those nights. What was it? 10 years now? Maybe 8 years ago? Something like that. A sleepless night. Every objection seemed to hit me. Every attack on the New Testament seemed to hit me. Every atheistic assault on the reality of God seemed to hit me. Every counter-missionary objection seemed to hit me. Everything questioning my experience in God over the years. I mean, it was intense. A sleepless night. The next day, I went back to this text and started digging, and whoa, that's what Matthew was saying. That's what he was getting at. Wow, so I want to go through this and take a little time and say, let's say this was something in Talmud, you're a religious Jew. You dig and try to figure out, okay, well, was he saying this, or was he saying this, or should I interpret it like this, or should I interpret it like this? Let's look at Matthew in a little more depth here. Matthew chapter 27. Are you ready? Matthew 27. Verse 3, when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus, Yeshua, was condemned, he changed his mind and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. So to whom? Chief priests and elders, saying, I've sinned by betraying innocent blood. They said, what is that to us? See to it yourself. And throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple, he departed, and he went and hanged himself. But the chief priests, taking the pieces of silver, said, it is not lawful to put them into the treasury, since it's blood money. So they took counsel and bought with them the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. Therefore that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken by the prophet Jeremiah, saying, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him on whom a price had been set by some of the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field as the Lord directed me. Problem number one, that's not Jeremiah, that's Zechariah. Problem number one. Well, here's one answer. That just like you can quote a larger collection of writings, and within it you're quoting one, well, what if the scroll of Zechariah, being a smaller book, was joined together to the scroll of Jeremiah? So they're just quoting from Jeremiah, the larger scroll, and Zechariah was part of it. Hey, it's possible, but I've got no concrete evidence for it, nor is that what I think what's happening. I think what's happening here is this. And I'm quite sure of this, but I say I think just to lay this possibility out. That Matthew is primarily quoting Zechariah. He's primarily quoting Zechariah. I've had Zedekiah in the back of my mind for minutes now. He's primarily quoting Zechariah, but with reference to Jeremiah's prophecies about judgment on Jerusalem, judgment on the chief priests and elders. And he wants us to know it's not just a prophecy of Zechariah, it's also a prophecy of Jeremiah. Dig and look. And this is also one of those passages which indicates to us that he was reading this in Hebrew, not in Greek, not in an Aramaic paraphrase. So let me break this down for you, all right? Let me break this down for you. First problem, text seems to come from Zechariah 11 rather than anywhere in Jeremiah. Second, there's no reference to a potter's field in the text in Zechariah. They took the 30 silver coins, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used them to buy the potter's field as the Lord commanded me. Zechariah 11 through 13 doesn't mention a potter's field. Let's just go back and look at that. There's no potter's field mentioned. Here's what's written in Zechariah 11, beginning in verse 11. So it was annulled on that day, and the sheep traders who were watching me knew that it was the word of the Lord. Then I said to them, if it seems good to you, give me my wages, but if not, keep them. And they weighed out as my wages 30 pieces of silver. Then the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the lordly price at which I was priced by them. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter. Matthew says they took the 30 silver coins, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used them to buy the potter's field as the Lord commanded me. So, first thing, did Matthew get Zechariah and Jeremiah confused? Well, the problem with that is that he had a long time to work on this. To get it confused is strange, and then why didn't all the scribes afterwards just change it? Okay, Matthew made a mistake here. Made a mistake. We're copying this text out, and we see you made a mistake. So that's unlikely. He's quoting from memory, made a mistake. Well, he wasn't just quoting from memory. He'd studied these things, looked at them for years. And the idea that a later scribe changed it, well, you're not going to do that. The scribe's not going to change something correct and make it into something erroneous, then everybody else copies that out. And the idea that it was part of a larger scroll, and it's possible many Christians use that explanation. I'm in no way convinced of it. So my understanding is this: while quoting primarily from Zechariah, Matthew is pointing the reader to a key passage or theme in Jeremiah as well, one that tied in with the point he wanted to make. Thus, to draw this to the reader's attention, he made reference to Jeremiah, since the reference to Zechariah would be obvious. Now, we have Mark, by the way, quoting from both Isaiah and Malachi, but it says it's written in Isaiah the prophet. So he quotes Isaiah and Malachi, but just references Isaiah, the greater one, the one that comes first, quotes that, and then quotes Malachi as well. So Matthew could be doing something similar to this. Well, what about the potter's field? Now, I'm going to expand on this, but I just want to lay this out. What about the potter's field? And I'm going into depth in this just to show you how we would do this, to show you how we tackle an objection head on and dig deep into it and see what we can learn. What about the potter's field? Well, first let's deal with the issue of the potter. In the NIV, Zechariah 11:13 reads, and the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the handsome price at which they priced me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter. The New Jewish Version reads, the Lord said to me, deposit it in the treasury. And I took the 30 shekels and deposited in the treasury in the house of the Lord. With a note that the meaning of some of the words, including treasury, is uncertain. This is interesting. In the Hebrew text, it reads hayotzer, the potter, but some textual and interpretive traditions understood this to be the equivalent of ha'otsar, the treasury. That's how some of the rabbinic commentaries read it. Or ha'otzer, the keeper of the treasury. So rabbinic traditions are saying, is this the potter, or is it treasury, or the keeper of the treasury? The only issue is that the Hebrew yotzer itself does not mean treasurer or treasury or keeper of the treasury. It does not mean that. It means potter, one who forms things within the Hebrew Scriptures. Also, the text literally says throw it, not deposit it. Not deposit it in the treasury, but throw it to the potter. The Septuagint understood hayotzer to refer to the furnace, smelt meaning smelter, a possible with otherwise unattested usage of this noun in the Tanakh. So which version did Matthew follow? Well, he cited the Septuagint in part, but did he cite it here? No, not in full here. Did he follow the tradition reflected later in the Targum, the Targumic interpretation, tying it with the treasury? No. See, these were interpretive traditions that were available in his day, either in writing or orally. Did he follow either one? No. What did he do? He translated directly from the Hebrew, rendering hayotzer as the potter, but with the addition of one detail that in hindsight made tremendous prophetic sense. The money that was cast into the house of the Lord for the potter was actually used to buy the potter's field. Matthew is adding that in to explain the money for the potter was given to buy the potter's field. What did the potter do with the money? The potter bought a field. In other words, this was not a matter of Matthew creating a story to fit the biblical text, as if his secret agenda was to make it look as if Jesus fulfilled the prophecies. Rather, as Carson noted, D.A. Carson, when we examine Matthew's quotation clause by clause, we can see impressive reasonings for holding that the narrative does not grow out of the prophecy. Did you get that? Matthew is talking about the potter using the money to buy a field, right? Zechariah 11 doesn't speak about the potter's field. It speaks about the potter. If Matthew was saying, ooh, look at this. I'm going to create a narrative that the money was used to buy a potter's field. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a narrative, the money was used to buy a potter's field, then I'm going to put that back in the Hebrew text. Well, why when the Hebrew text doesn't talk about it? Rather, this actually happened. The money was actually used to buy the potter's field, and Matthew looks at this, says the same 30 pieces of silver involved in a betrayal, 30 pieces of silver, and the potter's field is bought. Zechariah 11 says, given to the potter. Potter's field is bought with the 30 pieces of silver. This actually happened. Oh, look at this. He didn't create the text in Matthew to line up with something that wasn't in Zechariah. Something actually happened in his day, and when he looked back at Zechariah, he said, what do you know? Look at this. But let's go further with this. Let's go further. Why did he make reference to Jeremiah? It's one thing to say, okay, small jump. I took the 30 pieces of silver, threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter. Small jump from that to the potter for his field. I mean, that's nothing. Why did he make reference to Jeremiah? Wasn't this prophecy close enough? Why didn't he just say Zechariah? Why did he make reference to Jeremiah? There's a reason for it. Any reader familiar with the scriptures would have known that the verse itself was drawn from Zechariah, not Jeremiah. So there must be something else to which Matthew was pointing. Now, some said, well, maybe he talks about the potter in Jeremiah 18. Interesting, but no real connection. Well, he buys a field in Jeremiah 32. Is it talking about buying the field? No. I don't think so there. Jeremiah 19. This is the larger prophecy, Jeremiah 19 and Zechariah 11. Check this out. Jeremiah 19, the prophet is commanded by the Lord to buy a clay jar from a yotzer potter. And he's to take it in the presence of the elders and the priests. Remember Matthew 27, the chief priests and the elders? And he's to go to the valley of Ben Hinnom near the entrance of the potsherd gate. And he's to proclaim a word of solemn judgment. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Listen, I'm going to bring a disaster on this place that will make the ears of everyone who hears it tingle. 19:11, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I will smash this nation and the city just as this potter's jar is smashed and cannot be repaired. Now, look at this. 19:4. Not only would God destroy Jerusalem because of its idolatry, but also because, quote, they have filled this place with the blood of the innocent. Matthew 27:4. What does Judas say? I have betrayed innocent blood. What happens to Jerusalem as a result of the betrayal of innocent blood in Jeremiah's day? City destroyed. What happens to Jerusalem as a result of the betrayal of the Messiah and shedding of innocent blood? City destroyed. And interestingly, just a linguistic connection, a yotzer, a potter, connected with Jeremiah 19 and connected with Zechariah chapter 11. And hang on. It was this blood money that was used to buy the potter's field, called what? Field of blood. And to whom did Judas make this confession? And who was it that decided to use the blood money to buy the potter's field? It was the chief priests and the elders, shades of Jeremiah 19:1. Note also that Jeremiah, after breaking the potter's jar, declares They will bury the dead in Tophet, in the valley of Ben Hinnom, until there is no more room, where the potter's field in Matthew 27 becomes as a burial place for foreigners. As a result, Michael Knowles points out, whereas both were formerly associated with potters, they now carry names connoting bloodshed, valley of slaughter, and field of blood. So what was Matthew actually saying here? What was Matthew actually saying? He's saying, remember the potter. Remember the blood guilt. Remember Jeremiah's prophecy about the destruction of our city and temple. It happened just as he said it would. And today there's even greater blood guilt with even greater consequences. We betrayed God's Son. We've given the Messiah over to death. Judgment is near. So by citing Zechariah, which is very literal, with the 30 pieces of silver now being taken and given to the potter, and Jeremiah says yes, Matthew says yes, to buy the field, the potter's field. Messiah betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. He cites Zechariah, but he references Jeremiah to make you dig deeper. And then you realize, oh my, blood guilt. Chief priests and elders seeing this, complicit, not repenting. Potter, field of blood, valley of slaughter, foreigners buried. Wow. Jeremiah is speaking of this. Zechariah is speaking of this. Matthew ties them together. D.P. Senior notes, the explicit details which have been fulfilled are spelled out in the words of Zechariah, but it is the tragic tone of Jeremiah's prophecy that colors the accomplishment of God's will in a moment of betrayal and truth. And other scholars have pointed out that there's a connection between Jesus and Jeremiah in many ways through Matthew's gospel, hence yet another connection at the end here. Now, here's a question. Was Zechariah really prophesying the betrayal of the Messiah? Listen to what the Jewish Study Bible says. This is written by leading Jewish academics. Many ancient readers found in Zechariah numerous references to Messianic times. As expected, some early Christian readers understood them in Christological terms. See, for instance, Mark 14:27, Zechariah 13:7, smite the shepherd, the sheep will be scattered. Matthew 27:9 and Zechariah 11:12 and 13. John 19:37, the look on me whom they've pierced, Zechariah 12:10. John 12:15 and Zechariah 9:9, the Messiah riding meek and lowly on a donkey. Rabbinic Judaism interpreted many of these texts in relationship to Messianic times as well. Messianic times still to come, they say. Zechariah 3:8, 6:12, and the Targum are understood with reference to Messiah. Zechariah 12:10, pointing to the Messiah from the house of David in the Talmud, Sukkah 52a. But is there messianic significance to Zechariah 11:12 and 13? You know, it's fascinating. Rabbinic interpretation here is all over the place. They weighed out my hire 30 pieces of silver. Targum Jonathan, this is Rashi, paraphrases, and they performed my will with a few men. There were a few good men among them, such as the craftsmen in the centuries, Daniel, and so on and so forth. But I do not know how to explain the expression here of 30 pieces of silver exactly. Rashi says, I don't know, except that kesef, silver, is an expression of desire. Our sages too explained it in this way: the bundle of desirable ones he took in his hand. The 30 they explained in the following manner: there are 45 righteous men in every generation. They brought proof from Hosea 3, and on. You get to 15, down to 30, and 15 in Babylon, 30 in Israel. I took the 30 pieces of silver, cast them into the house of the Lord in the land of Israel. Number 30 is explained by the Midrash, that our father Abraham was promised that no generation would have fewer than 30 righteous. It's like, what? It's all over. It's 30 pieces of silver. Here, summary of what rabbinic commentaries said: standard wage for a shepherd, 30 pieces. The 30 pieces allude to 30 righteous people who are alive in every generation, and on and on. No. Matthew sees this is talking about the shepherd. This is talking about the shepherd who's betrayed, the shepherd who's rejected, the shepherd who represents the king, the ruler of the people. And it literally happens with regard to the Messiah. He's sold for just 30 pieces of silver. He's betrayed. And then the money given to the potter, Matthew says, to buy the potter's field. And then the striking parallels between Jeremiah 19 and Matthew 27. So I take time to say, the deeper you dig, the more rich insight you get, put against the grid of Jewish interpretation of the first century. This is amazingly sober and deep. What I want to do now is step back. We've looked in real depth at one passage which on the surface seems to be so wrong in terms of misquoting, misusing the Hebrew Scriptures, and saw it was anything but that. It preserves tremendous depths of insights for us. What I want to do now is step back and look at a number of objections to Yeshua being the Messiah based on the New Testament, but I'm going to do it in shorter form. All of these are listed. We get in great depth in these in volume 4 of my series. The objection that the New Testament is full of historical accuracies can be brought by religious skeptics who don't believe any of the Bible, who question the existence of God, and that's one thing. And I'm not going to get into an extensive rebuttal of that simply because there are many other books that deal with Bible difficulties. There are commentaries that get into great depth in terms of apparent contradictions and so on. I want to look at this from another angle, namely the angle of a religious Jew who believes the Tanakh to be God's word, believes in the Hebrew Scriptures, believes in a certain inspiration in the Talmud as well, and yet would say the New Testament is full of historical inaccuracies. Let me say, number one, that the more archaeological finds we have made and the more historical records we've uncovered, the more confidence we have in the accuracy of the New Testament records. However, if someone wants to throw out the New Testament and says it cannot be God's word, it has all these contradictions, they want to throw that out, and they believe the Hebrew Scriptures to be God's word, they have a problem because there are far more apparent contradictions in the Hebrew Bible than there are in the New Testament. Far more historical issues. Did this really happen as recorded? Does archaeology support it? Does this passage contradict this passage? Far more problems when reading the Hebrew Scriptures as opposed to reading the New Testament Scriptures. Years ago, I wrote an article called Unequal Weights and Measures. We have it as an appendix in volume 5 of my series, Unequal Weights and Measures, where I showed that counter-missionaries and rabbis would attack the New Testament in one way, but if they use that same canon of criticism, if they approach the Hebrew Scriptures with the same canon of criticism, and even more if they approach the Talmud with the same canon of criticism, they'd have to wipe the whole thing out and say it's unreliable. You say, well, that's your answer? That there are errors in the Old Testament and we still believe it, so even though there are errors in the New Testament, still believe it? No, that's not my approach. Here's my approach. Use the same methodology for both. In other words, give the benefit of the doubt that the text could be right, that the author could be accurate. In the case of the Gospels, some excellent studies have been done recently that indicate that you have eyewitness testimony. The fact of the matter is, as we'll see in a moment, there's ample historical record that makes us understand that Jesus, Yeshua, truly lived and died at the time when he was attested to have lived and died, and the faith in his resurrection is not just some made-up thing. We can demonstrate that from another angle as well. What I'm saying is use the same methodology. So if you're a rabbi, if you're an Orthodox Jew, if you're a counter-missionary, and you explain certain apparent contradictions within the Hebrew Scriptures with a certain method, use that same method for the New Testament. Oh, I'm not saying the same interpretive method of Peshat, Darash, or things like this, or Pardes, and these various methods of Jewish hermeneutics, or 7 rules, or on, or Malbim coming up with, 613 grammatical rules of interpretation. I'm not talking about that. I'm simply saying, if you have what appears to be a historical inaccuracy or a contradiction between texts, and both of them are supposed to be giving history, both of them are supposed to be giving accurate accounts, how do you treat it? Well, you say, okay, is there a way to reconcile this? Or maybe we have insufficient archaeological data here. Or maybe we're looking at data here, but we should be looking at data here. If you'll do it with the same approach, you'll see that the New Testament documents are highly reliable and accurate. But let me just give you one tiny example. The Gospels talk about Yeshua giving a word to his disciples that there's some standing among him who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom glory and his kingdom power. And then it says that he takes them up on a mountain. 3 of them go up on a mountain with him to pray. And at that time, they see him glorified. Seems to be the very thing he was speaking of some days earlier. Well, one account says after 6 days. The other says on the 8th day. Oh, contradiction. No. It's all a matter of how you reckon things. Okay, if I told you something on a Monday, and then after 6 days, okay, so now 6 days go by, now we're at Sunday. After 6 days, okay, that could now be back to Monday. Or if I'm counting Monday to Monday, that's the 8th day. In other words, there's no contradiction there if you're willing to recognize that 2 people could legitimately recount the same thing a little differently. I could be talking about New York City 300 years ago. You know, there was a man living in New York City 300 years ago. You say, wait a second, there was no such place as New York City 300 years ago. Oh, I mean the place we now call New York City. Someone lived there 300 years ago. So if we'll use the same fair method rather than try to attack and destroy, a fair and honest method to say, is it possible that there is no contradiction? Is it possible that there is a good, rational explanation for an apparent contradiction? You'll see that they resolve themselves. We're told that none of the important historical writers of the period, Roman or Jewish, make mention of Yeshua. It's questionable whether he even existed. Well, that's not really a Jewish objection. That's more of just a nihilistic, agnostic objection, or a faith-denying objection. Why do I say it? Well, even the most critical scholars who don't believe the New Testament is God's word, or don't believe the Bible is God's word, or don't believe Jesus was any special figure, virtually all of them, the top scholars, recognize, of course, he existed. And in fact, we do have major testimony from the ancient historians. We don't have any preserved writings. If there was a major historian who wrote at the time of Yeshua, a major Roman historian, he's got his annals of history at that time, we don't have those preserved, period. But the Roman historians were not like CNN reporters. It's not like getting an app on your phone and as the news happens, bing, you find it out. They would step back and they would wait and they would look at the scope of history and then they would write their histories. And those who do make reference to Yeshua. Or there are other anecdotal references about him being crucified under Pilate, or about his followers worshiping him as a god of some kind. And in fact, they didn't understand what Christos meant because that was a Jewish concept, the anointed one. Some thought his name was Crestus and his followers were Christians. But they attested to him and to the followers. And you have major historians and minor. Again, I document that all in my book, but just giving you the overview. Josephus does speak about Yeshua, but we are confident, we are sure that there are additions to his account, that he wrote certain things about Yeshua, and then later, apparently, Christian authors added to his account, forged things, added to it. That's the best way to understand it. Almost no major Josephus scholars believe that the text as we have it today recounts exactly what he said about Yeshua in his day. But the great majority, the great majority of Josephus scholars recognize that he, the most prominent Jewish historian of the first century, does attest to Yeshua's existence without question. How much he said is debated, but that he attested to his existence is hardly debated at all. Let me go further. The Talmud itself mentions the crucifixion of Jesus at the time of Passover, or his being hanged. The Talmud speaks of it and says that the court sentenced him to death. And Moses Maimonides, in his Mishnah Torah, speaks of it explicitly. The exact same way speaks of it. So the idea that he didn't exist, it's not a Jewish objection. As I said, the Talmud mentions his death, Maimonides mentions his death, and they mention it as something that Jewish law wanted carried out because of his alleged sins and crimes. So his existence, his historical existence, is not to be questioned. And the fact that his followers were willing to die for him after having seen him rise from the dead, and that there are numerous eyewitnesses who claim to have physically seen him rise from the dead, you have to understand, People lose loved ones all the time. People lose leaders of movements all the time. People lose beloved heroes all the time. And they want to believe that person exists. And they want to have some type of scenario like some of the devoted followers of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that his death was just a test for our faith. And if you go to the grave, he's not really there, that he's spiritually risen. But where are the ones with all their devotion saying we have physically seen him and eaten with him, and we have seen him physically risen from the dead? You see, those types of myths don't just rise out of nothing. There is ample historical reason to believe in the resurrection of Yeshua, but that's something for another class to take up. More importantly, he continues to do from heaven by his Spirit what he did on the earth, testifying to his ongoing existence. Well, Jesus was not born of a virgin. We have our own Jewish traditions that tell us who his real father was, and it wasn't Joseph. But anyway, the idea of a God giving birth, or a God being born to a virgin, or a God giving birth to a child through a virgin is just one of several pagan myths that made its way into the New Testament. First, the idea that Yeshua was born through an adulterous relationship or an immoral relationship between Miriam, Mary his mother, and a Roman soldier named Pandera is just that. It is a myth. It is a Jewish myth. It is a Jewish attack on the faith in Jesus. And it most likely comes from the fact that the Greek word for virgin is parthenos, hence Pandera, Panthera, a play on that name, saying, no, that was actually a Roman soldier. The fact is, it is a myth. It has zero credibility. It has zero historical background. It has zero attestation in any early source whatsoever. It is nothing less than a myth. But it's actually a myth that highlights something. You don't make up a story that your Savior, your Messiah, was born of a virgin. Do a little study of world religions. Do a little study of cults and false religions. Some of the cult leaders claim to be divine. They claim to be God. Then, of course, they died. They're going to live forever. They died. Why don't they claim they were born of a virgin? Well, one thing is, obviously, you can't go back and prove that. But the other thing is, it's not the kind of story you make up. What do I mean? It just opens up the door to charges of immorality. In fact, in Yeshua's own day in the Gospels, people say you were born out of wedlock. You were born out of wedlock. You don't make up a story like this. You say, yeah, well, they made it up based on Isaiah 7:14. No, as we saw studying that passage, Isaiah 7:14 does not immediately obviously say that the Messiah will be born of a virgin. Therefore, look for this. It was rather the reality of the virgin birth and the supernatural life and death and resurrection and ascension of the Messiah that caused the New Testament writers to look back, caused Matthew to look back, obviously by inspiration of the Spirit and Yeshua opening his eyes to look back and see, this is actually foreshadowed in the text. So this is not the kind of thing you create. Now, I can't prove it happened, but you certainly can't prove it was a myth. I'm saying it's illogical to say it was a myth. That's the first thing. And the second thing is this. When you look at all of the other supposed pagan parallels, they are so radically different. They are so completely unrelated to anything anywhere near this that it's absolutely absurd to suggest for a split second that that myth was borrowed into the New Testament. Even critical New Testament scholars, I've read their studies, said, yeah, this is completely different. In fact, the myths help us to see how completely different this is. The myth would be some so-called God comes down and has sex with a woman or something like that happens, as opposed to the Holy Spirit supernaturally touching Miriam, and now this virgin gives birth to the Son of God. So those arguments just disappear. What about the genealogies? There are about 3 major arguments to the genealogies in Matthew and Luke that are raised. One of the main objections is that the genealogies are hopelessly contradictory. A second one is that if the Messiah is David's son, and if he's born of a virgin, that means his father is not from the line of David, so he's not really David's son, because royal lineage and just tracing lineage in general, it goes through the father, not through the mother. We're not talking about is your mother Jewish or you Jewish, as Jewish tradition would teach. We're talking about lineage. So-and-so, the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so. Well, if Yeshua is virgin born, then he's not of the line of David. So one argument, the genealogies are hopelessly contradictory. Second argument is that if Yeshua is actually born of a virgin, then he's not the son of David. Third argument is that according to Luke's gospel, he does not come through the line of Solomon, but through the line of David. We're talking the line of Nathan. We're talking about sons of David. So David, Solomon, Messiah. David, Nathan, Messiah. We're told, no, he has to come through the line of Solomon. If he doesn't come from the line of Solomon, then he's not really the Messiah. We're also told that according to the genealogies, he comes through the cursed line of Jeconiah, Jehoiachin, Coniah. It's different names given to the same king. Jeremiah has a curse from the Lord on him that none of his descendants will sit on the throne. And yet Yeshua, it goes through that cursed line, therefore he couldn't be the Messiah. Let me treat those in reverse order. And again, I'm going through this as quickly as I can so that we can look at these objections, New Testament and traditional Jewish objections, in an overview, focusing on a few in more depth, but answering these others more quickly. Okay. Number one, we're going in reverse order. Yeshua cannot be the Messiah because he comes through the cursed line of Jeconiah. That's very easy to refute. Jeremiah 22 says that he'll be cursed, that none of his sons will sit on the throne. Render him as childless. Now, genealogically, we know from the Hebrew Bible that he had children. But count him as childless because none of his sons will sit on the throne. All it's saying is, don't put your hopes in him. He's in exile, all right? The rest of the Jewish community, many of them are about to suffer exile. Temple's going to be destroyed. And God's saying, no, don't put your hope in him. He's not coming back to rule and reign. None of his sons, he's cursed. None of his sons are going to rule and reign. Now, what's interesting is that his own father, Jehoiachin, in Jeremiah 36, has a curse spoken over him that none of his sons will sit on the throne. And yet one of his sons, Jehoiachin, does, but it's only for 3 months. So literally, the curse was not fulfilled, but in terms of the spirit of it, it was. He was removed from the throne, and that was it. You say, but it says no sons, but sons can mean descendants. Doesn't it mean none of his descendants would sit on the throne? No, because God says in Jeremiah 22, even if he were a signet ring on my hand, I would take him off. I would take him off and throw it away. I'd take this ring off, throw it away. I mean, it was that close to me, that precious to me. Haggai 2 speaks this prophecy over Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel being the grandson of Jeconiah. And it says about him, I will make him a signet ring on my finger. In other words, I'm undoing the curse. I'm reversing the curse. Jeremiah 52 tells us that after being in exile for decades, Jehoiachin is raised up and given a favored seat at the king's table. And rabbinic literature, I looked at this, saw this in Scripture, determined this is what it must mean. But rabbinic literature tells us that the curse was reversed through repentance. So there's absolutely no problem with the Messiah coming through this line. You say, yeah, but the Messiah had to be a descendant of Solomon. And God gave promises to David and said, through your seed, the lineage will continue, the royal lineage will continue, and then after that, made the same promise to Solomon. That's true. Made the same promise to Solomon. The problem is, it was a conditional promise to Solomon. It was a conditional promise to Solomon, and God specifically says to Solomon that if you break my commandments, if you disobey me, then I will take this promise away from you. And it says you did disobey. So notice 1 Chronicles 28:7, I will establish his kingdom forever if he is unswerving in carrying out my commands and laws as is being done at this time. If he's unswerving. He wasn't. And 1 Kings, the 11th chapter, makes it clear that God says, I'm going to take the kingdom away from him. I'm still going to preserve a remnant because of David. So the promise to Solomon was rescinded. The Messiah does not have to come from the line of Solomon. Now, there are some rabbinic traditions that say that, but that's rabbinic tradition. It is not Bible. The Messiah did not have to come through the line of Solomon. And let me point this out. The rest of the Hebrew scriptures speak of what? Throne of David, not throne of Solomon. Son of David. Who is the Messiah called? What is the Messiah called in rabbinic literature? Son of David. When will the Son of David come? Not the Son of Solomon. What throne does he sit on? The throne of Solomon or the throne of David? Throne of David. You get the point. The Messiah is David's son, not Solomon's son. He could have come through the line of Solomon, but he did not have to. You say, well, but what about the fact that as we look at the text, we know that the Messiah is son of David, son of David, son of David, son of David. If he's virgin born, then Joseph is not his father. How can he be the son of David? Two answers. Number one, the Messiah was not just the son of David, he was also greater than David. He was the son of David, and he was greater than David. How could he do both? He was virgin born. He was virgin born. We saw looking at Psalm 110 that he is exalted more than David. We see in Daniel 7, he comes in the clouds of heaven. He sits at the right hand of God according to Psalm 110. So, he is greater than David. That's number one. How is he greater than David? By being born of a virgin. Son of God and yet son of David. How is he also son of David? He comes through the line of Miriam. He comes through the line of Miriam. He is born of a woman who is a descendant of David. I believe that's the best way to read Luke's genealogy, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Looking at Luke's genealogy and understanding that she, Miriam, the mother, is a descendant of David. You say, wait a second, where does it say in the Bible that you can trace a descendant through the mother? Well, if there was no earthly father in a certain case to carry on the line, like the daughters of Zelophehad, Numbers 27, Numbers 36, then inheritance rights could come through the woman. They could come through the woman as long as she married within the tribe, which would be the same case here. So that's the first thing. Inheritance rights could go to the woman if there was no man. Second thing, you have in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, there's a genealogy, verses 34, 35 in this section, and it mentions Sheshan had no sons. Sheshan had no sons, only daughters. And then one of the daughters marries an Egyptian. And then the genealogy continues. Now, hang on. The genealogy continues as if it's the genealogy of the father. The genealogy continues, even the way it's laid out. You'll see it in the New Jewish Version, for example, the translation. You see how the genealogy continues. Why does it continue the genealogy of this man, this man, this man, this man, if it stops with the daughter? It continues it because it doesn't stop with the daughter. It's not going through an Egyptian. It's not going through the Egyptian unless the Egyptian is adopted and considered part of the family. Either way, the lineage, he did not have the lineage of the father, the daughter did. So in this particular case, it's in a genealogy that the lineage goes through the daughter, not the son, because there was no son. So we actually have precedent for that. So if we can demonstrate that Yeshua is a blood descendant of David through Miriam, his mother, and the rights to the royal throne through Joseph, his adopted father, then it works perfectly. And he is also greater than David. But that leaves the question, but aren't the genealogies contradictory anyway? And can we even argue for a split second that Miriam's genealogy is preserved in Luke, the 3rd chapter? Does that even work? These are fair questions. But just bear in mind, Matthew puts the genealogy up front, beginning of his book. Luke puts the genealogy, chapter 3, in a major portion of the book. They weren't embarrassed. They weren't embarrassed about the genealogies. Otherwise, why put them there? And the gospel authors did not just put accounts there and then later editors let them stand side by side when everyone knew they were hopelessly contradictory. It makes no sense if you're trying to promote your faith. Obviously, there is much more to the story. So we'll take up the question of apparent contradictions in our next lecture. We want to take a little bit more time and look at the issues of the two genealogies, the one preserved in Matthew 1, the one preserved in Luke 3, because we're commonly told these totally disqualify Jesus from being the Messiah. So just to review for a moment, the idea that he cannot be the Messiah because he comes through the cursed line of Jeconiah. There are actually some Messianic Jews who say, aha, that means he had to be virgin born because that was the only way to transcend that curse. I would say, no, you don't need to use that argument because Haggai 2, Jeremiah 52 point in this direction, and then rabbinic literature even confirms this, that Jehoiachin repented at some point in his life and God reversed the curse. The idea that the Messiah had to come from the line of Solomon is not accurate. That was a promise that God gave to David that would then continue through Solomon. Solomon forfeited that. The text is quite explicit in Kings and Chronicles that Solomon forfeited that because of his sin. That's why we talk about the Messiah as the son of David, not the son of Solomon. That's why we talk about the throne of David as opposed to the throne of Solomon. The idea that if the Messiah is virgin born, he cannot be the Messiah because he cannot be the son of David. Well, no, he had to be virgin born because he is both the son of David and greater than David, the son of David and the son of God, according to prophecy. This is the only way that it could fulfill both. And let me ask you one other question. Halakhically speaking, according to Jewish law, what's the ruling about a virgin-born child? There is no halakha on it because the case did not exist in Jewish law. Well, we have this case, in a sense, it transcends law. And more importantly, we can demonstrate through the Hebrew Scriptures that in certain cases where there was no son, inheritance rights could go to the daughter, and then that would then transfer to the family she married within the tribe. And descent could even be traced through a daughter. She would then marry someone, and then the children that they had would continue the father's genealogy through her. We have that account in 1 Chronicles, the 2nd chapter. What about the larger issue that the genealogies are hopelessly contradictory? Again, the first problem I have with that assumption is the genealogies are given pride of place in Matthew and Luke. They're put in very strategic parts. Matthew starts off with this. This is the book of the genealogy, or the book of the descent of Yeshua the Messiah, son of David, son of Abraham. He puts that in a prominent place. And then Luke, after Yeshua's immersion in water with John the Immerser, and then traces him back all the way to the beginning, all the way back to Adam. So in point of fact, there's no question that the gospel authors wanted these accounts to be made. You say, yeah, well, maybe Matthew wrote his thing over here and Luke wrote his over here, and they never compared notes. Yeah, but there were those that then received these as scripture. And there were those that then edited these together and said these are part of the four gospels, and we take these accounts as secret, the Besorah, the good news. So if it was so obvious that they were completely contradictory, you just wonder how that actually happened. Now, there's no question that there are apparent contradictions. I don't argue that for a split second. I would point out that you have even more apparent contradictions in accounts in the Hebrew Bible. Even some historical narratives that talk about how this one knew this one and how this one did, sometimes they seem to contradict themselves. And with the genealogies, you often have contradictions. So what we need to do again is that same method, not of accepting error, not of winking at error, not of saying, well, I believe no matter what, but saying, okay, let's look at this sympathetically to see if there is a way to resolve the apparent contradictions. So Luke gives us more names than Matthew does. But Matthew is systematically giving his genealogy around 3 groups of 14. In fact, he repeats one name. You have to count it as twice to get to the 14. That may have been the genealogy he had because there are different genealogical records. And he notices, okay, we can divide this into 3 groups of 14, or maybe that's how the record was divided. And it could be the 3 groups of 14 was because the name David in Hebrew has a numeric value of 14. Dalet 4, Vav 6, Dalet 4. So is that why he's saying 14, 14, 14, David, 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 this is the son of David, this is the greater David, this is the Messiah? Could be. The fact that Luke gives more names, you have that when you compare genealogies within the Hebrew Bible. That's not uncommon, that one author will give you extra names. So one is saying this is the literal son of this one, the literal son of this one, the literal son of this one. The other is saying this one is the descendant of this one, the descendant of this one, the descendant of this. That's simple. No problem there. But let's look at this. Let's look at this. Matthew traces it David, Solomon. Luke traces it David, Nathan. All right? So we've got our first change there. Clearly, we're being told that the royal line, from David to Solomon to Rehoboam, the royal line of each one who was king goes through David, Solomon. We don't argue that. Okay? We simply say that the Messiah did not have to be a son of Solomon or a son of these other kings to be considered the son of David and therefore the Messiah. But we see the line goes through Solomon. This is the royal line, all right? Each royal king, and then all the way down to Joseph. So Joseph was in the lineage of the royal line. That's what Matthew is telling us. But when we get to Josiah, then Jeconiah, then Shealtiel, then Zerubbabel. Josiah, Jeconiah, who's actually the grandson of Josiah, Shealtiel, Zerubbabel. Now, when we are in Luke's gospel, we have Neri, Shealtiel, and Zerubbabel, and then it diverges from there. Well, after Zerubbabel, if it diverges, that's no problem, right? That's no problem because different children, you just trace it through different ones. That's not a problem. But it seems to be a problem when you have Jeconiah, Shealtiel, Zerubbabel, versus Neri, Shealtiel, Zerubbabel. If you look carefully, I don't want to take the time to get into this, but if you look carefully in 1 Chronicles, the 3rd chapter, and when you look at the descent here of these men, these related men, 1 Chronicles chapter 3, and the sons of Pedaiah were Zerubbabel and Shimei, and the sons of, the sons of Pedaiah were Zerubbabel and Shimei, but elsewhere in the Hebrew Scriptures, he is known as what? Son of Shealtiel. Son of Shealtiel. How could that be? A levirate marriage. What's a levirate marriage? That is, we'll say, Joseph dies. We'll say Joseph Schwartz dies. And of course, they didn't have names like that in ancient Israel, but to make the point, Joseph Schwartz dies, and he has no children. He has a younger brother, Samuel Schwartz. He is married. Well, according to the Deuteronomic law, now Samuel, the younger brother, would marry the widow, Joseph's widow. We'd have two wives. Yeah, that would have been according to the law. Marries the widow, and then the first child that she has through him is now considered to be her late husband's child, Joseph's child. So Samuel is the biological father, but the lineage then continues on Joseph's end. So when you have accounts within the Hebrew Bible where it mentions the same man and two different fathers, that could easily be the explanation for us. We may have that once or twice in these genealogies, that you have the same name and then you have different fathers. There is even the possible argument that there was a levirate marriage with Miriam's father, and that's how things are traced, or Joseph's father. There are arguments like that. But once you realize, okay, you might have the same person, and he has his biological father, and then the lineage is traced through his biological father's older brother. So you have two possible different names for the same person. It works fine. And all I'm saying is the same way we try to resolve these issues within the Hebrew Scriptures, you apply them here, and it works out just the same way. So that would mean then that when we get to Luke's gospel, that Luke is telling us that that Yeshua was known, and we'll just look at the way it's phrased here in Luke chapter 3. Luke chapter 3, Yeshua himself began to be at 30 years old. He was being, as was supposed, the son of Joseph, which was the son of Heli, the son of Mattat, etc. There are two ways to read it. Everyone thought he was the son of Joseph. He was actually the son of God. and Joseph was the son of Heli. Well, that's a different name than you have in Matthew. Well, it's possible that Joseph's father, there was a levirate marriage in that case, just like with Zerubbabel having two different fathers listed in the Hebrew Scriptures. Could be the exact same thing here. Or it could be that we're being told this is Miriam's genealogy. Miriam's genealogy. And he was 30 years old, being, it was supposed, the son of Joseph, but actually the son of Miriam's father, Heli. You say, I don't know about that. It's exactly the same way that you try to reconcile and work out contradictions or apparent contradictions within the Hebrew Scriptures with the genealogies, and you got a lot more of those than these. So basically, there are good, workable explanations for all of these. Good, workable explanations. And if, in fact, Miriam is listed as from the line of David as well, then you have further verification of blood descent from David, and then adoption into the royal line through Joseph, and more importantly, through being the Son of God. If you want more depth on that, go through the material in Volume 4. But this is nothing for me that we need to stumble on in the least or even slow us down. Well, some would argue, yeah, but the New Testament authors themselves don't know about a virgin birth. It's hardly mentioned. Well, Matthew explains it at some length. Luke explains it at some length. Mark has no reference to the childhood or birth of Yeshua, but introduces him as the Son of God. And John introduces him as the eternal Word made flesh among us. And Paul speaks of him being declared the Son of God with power and appearing in a body, Romans 1 and then 1 Timothy 3. So those are hardly descriptions of just a regular human being. Of course, they knew and understood and recognized the virgin birth. We are told that Jesus didn't fulfill any of the Messianic prophecies. We know that the New Testament writers actually reconstructed the life of Jesus so as to harmonize it with certain predictions made by the prophets. And then we're also told that when Jesus failed to fulfill the prophecies, his followers invented the myth of his substitutionary death, his resurrection, finally his second coming, which of course they completely expected in his lifetime. What I find funny here is that the same ones who were telling us that Yeshua did not fulfill the Messianic prophecies, that nothing lines up, now tell us that the New Testament writers rewrote things to make it look like he fulfilled them. First they're telling it doesn't even look like he fulfilled them. Then they're telling us, well, they rewrote things to make it look like he fulfilled them. Both arguments fall flat for this reason. As we demonstrated in teaching on Messianic prophecy, there are many things Yeshua has done and continue to do that cannot be manufactured. They weren't manufactured by the New Testament writers because they're happening to this day around the world. So to say that they manufactured things or rewrote things, how do you explain what's happened over the last 2,000 years in terms of what God has done? Not what people who denied the teaching of Jesus and departed from the Scriptures did in his name. No, we're not talking about that. But what he continues to do through his people around the world, supernaturally into the glory of God, and how this one Jew has brought hundreds of millions of Gentiles into the knowledge of the God of Israel. And how his resurrection continues to be demonstrated in acts of power today that glorify the God of Israel and that cause Hindus to smash their idols and cause Muslims to renounce their false views of God and cause atheists to recognize there is one true God. And there were prophecies that had to be fulfilled before the second temple was destroyed. If Yeshua didn't fulfill them, there's nobody that's going to be the Messiah. He's the only hope. He's the only hope. We have the down payment, the deposit, and the ongoing history of his work. He's the only possible candidate. That's why we're so sure he's coming again, and there'll be a turning of Jewish hearts to him. As for the notion that the New Testament writers rewrote things, here's what you have to understand. The New Testament authors tell us consistently in the Gospels that his followers didn't get it. You don't paint this picture of your leaders. You don't write this about your leaders unless you're writing the truth. They didn't get it. They didn't understand that he had to die. They didn't understand he was going to rise from the dead. They were baffled by this. And to take this message to the Roman world, that your Savior was crucified. This is the most self-defeating message you could possibly imagine. And that he was crucified for being a seditious king. This is not the kind of thing that you create or make up. Now, you could make up something, well, there's going to be a second coming, but my point is simple. He did everything that had to be done before the second temple was destroyed. He has continued to fulfill prophecy since then. Even if you made up the rest of the story, how do you explain the first part happening and the ongoing part happening? Obviously, they didn't make up the rest of the story. Finally, historians, by and large, even critical historians, accept the fact that there was this charismatic leader teacher named Yeshua, famous for healing and exorcism, and known to have been crucified under Pontius Pilate, with testimonies from his closest followers that he rose from the dead. Even critical scholars tend to agree on those basic points. They won't agree on the resurrection. They'll agree that there were testimonies to his resurrection. But they'll say, looking at the evidence and sifting it out, look, there's even later rabbinic writing that talks about, for example, the Tosefta, which is a little bit after the Mishnah, so a little bit later in the 3rd century, where it talks about a Messianic Jew, Yaakov by name, and how he was used in healing power, a disciple of Yeshua. There's a backhanded reference to this in the Talmud in Sanhedrin about someone who would whisper over a wound and speak Exodus 15:26, Ani Adonai Rofecha, I'm Lord your healer. And that certain things were not to be utilized. In other words, this is nothing for you to touch as a Jew, because this is what these followers of Jesus engage in. In other words, there's even an acknowledgement of healing power then. I'm not saying you have to believe that the power was real. I'm just saying the accounts were there. The accounts were there. Where they come from? Why not just a total Jewish denial? There's even the Jewish claim, Talmudic claim, that he learned magical arts in Egypt and so on and deceived the people. In other words, there's recognition that he was a miracle worker. And he said, I'm doing this because this is the kingdom of God coming. I'm doing this because this is evidence of God's love coming in your midst. He didn't do it by using demonic incantations. He did it by invoking the Holy Spirit that was upon him because he had been anointed by his Father in fulfillment of Scripture. We're told that the account in Matthew 27 is ridiculous, that it claims when Jesus died on the cross, the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs, and after Jesus' resurrection, they went to the holy city and appeared to many. People have said, well, if that really happened, someone would have recorded it. Well, Matthew did. Matthew recorded it. May sound extreme. Matthew recorded it. Now, some claim that it was just metaphorical image. It wasn't meant to be taken literally, and it was simply speaking of the future resurrection that will take place prophetically based on Messiah's resurrection from the dead. I guess it's possible that language like that could have been used and people would have understood it was just metaphorical language or spiritual language. It doesn't seem like that on first glance, and it is something radical and extreme, but we don't have a lot of written records from that day. These are the eyewitness accounts, you see. We don't have a lot of other eyewitness records from that day. That's what you have to understand. It's not like you can take a picture. Here's a sports event with 70,000 people there, and you can see, okay, there's 70,000 people. We had the ticket count. Here we can zoom in the screen. We can see that there are no empty seats. Here we can zoom in on the screen, and we can see this picture, this guy wearing this shirt. You don't have that. So there's simply no way to say what happened or didn't happen based on this account. Hey, what's recorded about the Exodus is pretty outlandish. And there's no evidence that we have for the extraordinary miracles of the Exodus taking place the way they took place in Egyptian literature of that day. We do not have hardcore archaeological confirmation or literary confirmation outside the Bible, or Elijah calling down fire from heaven, or the sundial going back a certain number of degrees when Hezekiah was healed as a sign, or the sun standing still with Joshua. And how can that be scientifically? Well, we don't have any outside verification of this. Same with this. So nothing to stumble over. If it happened, Matthew recorded it. If he made it up, he made it up. If Moses made things up, if Elijah made things up, if there was no one ever named Moses or Abraham, you could do this with much of the Bible. But to say I doubt it because it seems incredible, well, then doubt all the miracles in the Hebrew Bible because they seem incredible, because we don't have external verification for those either. What about the idea that the teachings of Jesus are impossible, dangerous, and un-Jewish? Hate your father, mother. Let the dead bury their own dead. Give to whoever asks you. There's no way he should be followed. Well, number one, when you put many of his teachings back into a first century Jewish context, you realize, oh, these are totally Jewish. And that's the background. It has to do with disputes within rabbinic law, developing rabbinic law, to call it properly, or it has to do with interpretations of the Hebrew Scriptures, and that's the explanation to it. Or it is simply an amplification of what is taught in the Scriptures, the Hebrew Scriptures. So I'll give you an example. Yeshua called for radical devotion to him. He said in Matthew 10, whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. He spoke of the division that would come through his coming into the world in Matthew 10, quoting from Micah 7, which we've seen in an earlier class, was actually a text quoted in the Mishnah at the end of Sotah, Tractate Sotah, referring to the disruption of family and separation that would come in the heels of the Messiah, footsteps of the Messiah, right before the Messiah was fully revealed. So the idea that there's upheaval and social upheaval and separation with the coming of Messiah, that he brings division, there's no surprise there. God speaking divided whole nations. Some followed God, some didn't. Who's on the Lord's side? That was a refrain in ancient Israel more than once. You're going to serve Yahweh, you're going to serve Baal. The prophetic word would often bring separation. But let's think of this. Exodus, the 32nd chapter, Moses asks who's on the Lord's side, and the Levites come over, descendants of Levi come over, and he then says, okay, go and kill your brother, your sister, whoever's been guilty of worshiping idols, go kill him. Now, this is a far cry from Yeshua talking about social division and family division. Put them to death with your sword, and then they're later in Deuteronomy commended for doing this very thing. How about Deuteronomy, the 13th chapter, which says, if a family member of yours, mother, father, brother, sister, son, daughter, is guilty of worshiping idols and trying to lead Israel into idolatry, you have to turn them in, and your hand is the first one to stone them to death. You are to be the first one to engage in stoning them to death out of loyalty to God. Radical loyalty, ruthless love. Yeshua called for that towards him, but not to hurt anyone, not to kill anyone. When he speaks in Luke, the 14th chapter, about hate father, hate mother, what he's talking about is completely renouncing and breaking every other hold, every other claim on your life, everything that would separate you from loyalty to him. And that was totally in keeping with allegiance in the Hebrew Scriptures. By the way, if you find some of these teachings of Yeshua to be dangerous, let me just say this. There are Talmudic accounts, great rabbi who's told your son is dying, he's sick, he's dying, he keeps studying, he keeps teaching, they need you. He keeps studying, he keeps teaching, and then finally after he dies, okay, now I'll go bury him. And that's commended. That's commended. I've read accounts, modern traditional Jewish accounts, of one man that became a great scholar in his, I believe, Eastern European community. And after years and years and years of being immersed in yeshiva, he's given a stack of letters from the head of the yeshiva. Head of the yeshiva had read all the letters, but never given them the letters. And what do the letters say? They talk about it. This family member died, and this family member died, this family member died, and the guy just absolutely shocked. Why didn't you ever show me these? Well, it would have disrupted your studies. Better that you just kept studying. That to me is extreme. That to me is something way beyond anything Yeshua taught. What he taught was absolute loyalty and allegiance to him because he was the Messiah, the anointed one, and the same allegiance that was shown to the God of Israel was to be shown to him as God's anointed one on the earth. Now, I want to just look at one or two other examples of teaching that may sound extreme and impossible and even dangerous, but when we put it back into its biblical and Jewish context, we'll see that it makes perfect sense. So does he call for radical surrender to him and absolute devotion to him? Of course he does. He's going to die for our sins. He deserves our all. He deserves our heart, our life, our mind, our body, our spirit, because we're serving God. But does he call for anything that is dangerous or anti-family? No, actually, the people that give themselves to him become better husbands, better wives, better moms, better dads, better sons, better daughters, better employees, you name it, because they're now honoring God and changed by his character. Let's look at this claim that some of the teachings of Yeshua are completely un-Jewish, and there's no possible way that any Jew would have uttered these, and they're dangerous and so on. But against the context of first century Jewish teaching, there's the one account we have, for example, in Matthew, the 8th chapter, where someone wants to follow him, and Yeshua says, follow me. And he said, all right, let me first bury my father, and then I'll follow you. And Yeshua says, let the dead bury their own dead. Come and follow me. How un-Jewish can you get? Well, there's no question he was saying, put me first. Put the Messiah first. Put loyalty to me first. But what we see with the others is that there were cheap excuses he was getting past. It's possible that this man is just saying, my dad's old. Let me wait till he dies and bury you. I got to be responsible, and then I'll come follow you. And Yeshua just knew it was procrastination. That's why he said what he said. But there's another view, and that is that there's evidence of a second burial that would take place some months after, a year after the actual burial, where the bones or what was left would be unearthed and then buried a second time. There's some Jewish evidence for that. And some say that that's what he was talking about. And Yeshua was saying, go on. The dead bury their own dead. Your father's dead and gone. Move on now and follow me. Yes, it's a radical call and meant to be radical without compromise. But when you realize that he's always cutting through excuses that don't really work, some scholars, Jewish included, have said maybe it was the second burial they were talking about. He wasn't saying, your dad just died and you got to bury him within 24 hours now, or leave. No, you don't have to say that that's what he was saying. Okay, let's think of a couple of others, though. In Matthew, the 5th chapter, the famous Sermon on the Mount, Yeshua says, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Now, he's not talking about self-defense, because he's dealing with the issue of, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It's called in Latin lex talionis, retaliatory law. This is still practiced in Saudi Arabia, for example, or Iran, where, let's say you viciously blind someone, that person can now petition the court to have you blinded. Or you get in a fight with someone and you're on the ground, you beat them and you paralyze them, that now the courts can have you paralyzed if the person refuses a bribe, a payment, not a bribe, a payment. If they said, no payment is enough, I want the same thing to happen. There are actually cases like this in the last few years that have come up and stirred world controversy in Iran and in Saudi Arabia. So biblical law, if taken literally, someone caused you to lose your eye, they lose their eye. Now, rabbinic teaching is that it was always monetary payment. It was never literally lex talionis, but that's another subject. What we know is that Jesus is not talking about self-defense. He's not saying if someone breaks into your home and rapes your wife, that you say, oh, by the way, I've got 2 teenage daughters down the hallway, sir, just go over there. No, he's not saying that. He's talking about legal retaliation. That's the context. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Okay, so right-handedness is presumed in the Bible, right? And that's the vast majority of people are right-handed. So that's presumed. Right-handedness, if someone strikes you on the right, whoa, hang on. If I take my right hand and strike you, I strike you on the left cheek. What's being presupposed here? A backhanded slap. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, boom, a backhanded slap. What's the significance of that? Well, in the Mishnah, and these laws well could have been current or at the very least developing in Yeshua's day, if someone publicly gave you a backhanded slap, you were entitled to a certain amount of monetary compensation, twice the amount, whereas if they had just slapped you with the front of their hand. So a backhanded slap to your right cheek, you were entitled double compensation. Yeshua says, no. You step higher. Love those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who persecute you. Don't try to retaliate. Don't try to have a vengeful spirit. You bless and leave justice and judgment to God. That's how Paul explains it in Romans, the 12th chapter. Quoting from Proverbs 25, if your enemy's hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. So even if you're entitled to public compensation for public shame, let him slap you on the other cheek. Don't worry about it. Step higher. Step higher. It makes sense when put in Jewish context. It has nothing to do with self-defense. Nothing whatsoever to do with self-defense. What about when Jesus says, give to him who asks you? Give to him who asks you. Matthew 5, Luke 6. I actually had a counter-missionary come up to me once outside of a Jewish bookstore. He just wanted me to give him what I had, give him the keys to my car, just give it to him. And I kind of went along with his game for a little while, and then it was just a game. But he was trying to say, look, you can't do what Jesus literally said to do. No one can practice that. Well, is there a Jewish context to that as well? Absolutely. Absolutely. Luke 6, Yeshua says that we should give to those who ask and lend expecting nothing in return. And he also explains that if we just lend to people who can pay us back, well, we're just doing what anybody else would do, what sinners would do. What any greedy person would do if they had the money for loan, you can pay me back? Yeah, I'll do it, that's fine. Well, what's the issue here? Very simple. It was Jewish law every 7th year. If you lent someone money, 7th year came and they couldn't finish paying it back, that they would be released. The 50th year, they'd be released from all debts. Lifetime servants would be released. Indentured land would be returned to owners, the Jubilee year. There's some scholars who believe that Yeshua was started his ministry in a Jubilee year in a 50th year, a year of debt release, at least on a 7th year. Well, there was a problem. God warned our people, Deuteronomy 15, don't be stingy. Don't think, well, the 7th year is approaching. Hang on. God's going to come to me for a loan. I loan him this money. It's the 5th year in this cycle. I loan him the money. He's going to pay me back for 6 months, a year and a half. Then the 7th year comes, and now he's free from the loan. I'm not going to lend him the money. I'm never going to get it back. Bad enough I can't charge interest to a fellow Jew, fellow Israelite, but I'm never going to get the money back at all. God said, don't think like that. Don't be greedy. No. Just bless. Just give, and God will bless you. Observing the Torah required supernatural faith. It required supernatural faith. Well, Hillel, who was the last of the so-called Zugot, the teaching pairs that were leading generations, Hillel and Shammai being the older contemporaries of Yeshua in the 1st century, which is then followed by the period of what's called the Tanaim, out of which the Mishnah is produced, and then followed by the period of what's called the Amoraim, out of which the Talmud is produced, the Amoraim and the Savaraim, out of which the Talmud is produced. Don't worry about all those terms right now. We'll actually come back to them right towards the end of this series of lectures. But Hillel developed something called the Prosbul. What was the Prosbul? It was a document that you would sign that said, when I am lending money to this poor person, they don't pay me back, they pay back the court. Because there was nothing that said that the court had to abide by this 7th year release, just the individual lender. So this was a way, a compassionate way of saying, okay, we want poor people to be able to get loans. We want them to be able to make it. However, we know that it's a hardship on the wealthy because many times they don't get their money back when the 7th year release comes. This way, everybody will be okay. The poor people will eventually pay back the loan to the court. The court gives it to the person that lent the money, and the other person is more willing to lend their money. Well, what it did is it bypassed the supernatural faith element. It bypassed the total dependence on God element. So, what does Yeshua say? In this very context, that's how we should understand it. Give to him who asks you. From him who would borrow, don't turn him away. Lend, expecting nothing in return. In other words, go ahead and do what the Torah told you to do. Do it in faith. And if you're not paid back in an earthly way, your heavenly Father will pay you back. He wasn't telling you that if someone knocks on your door, give me your house, please. I'd like your house. Hang on. I see you bought a new house. Give me that. Oh, excuse me. New car, I'd like that car. Oh, wardrobe. Give me. No, he was not saying that. He was encouraging his fellow Jews to do in faith what God had commanded them to do, and God's blessing would be on them. You put it in the Jewish context, now it makes perfect sense. Some argue that Yeshua was a false prophet, that he claimed that his apostles would live to see his return, a prediction he missed by at least 2,000 years. He also predicted that not one stone in Jerusalem would be left standing when the Romans destroyed it. Well, have you ever heard of the Wailing Wall? Well, actually, Wailing Wall was not part of the temple. This is a later extension to the temple. It was not physically part of the temple. But in Luke it says, in Jerusalem, no stone will be left upon another. Look at the Wailing Wall. What about the idea that he made clear that he was coming back in that generation, that his own disciples would see him return? Well, when you look at the account of the Transfiguration, which interestingly in Matthew, Mark, and Luke follows immediately on his statement that there's some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in glory, coming in his kingdom. Well, in point of fact, about a week later, they saw him glorified, coming in kingdom power. And then John, on the Isle of Patmos, has a vision, a revelation of Jesus in kingdom power and glory. So they did get to see that. Elsewhere, he warned, he talked about in parables that he would be going away. It'd be like a king going away on a long journey. On a long journey. And he warned about people thinking, he's not going to come back and so on. So he's already preparing the way for this. When he talks about certain things that had to happen in Matthew 24, in Mark 13, Luke 21, and that this generation would see these things, this generation would not pass away before all these things fulfilled. Either he was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, which did take place at that time, and not about his ultimate return, which is separate, which he then says, no man knows the day, no man knows the hour. That's a totally legitimate way of reading it. Some argue when he says this generation, he means this race, meaning the Jewish people, and that they will not cease to exist until he returns, which of course would be true. And others would interpret it that he's saying, look, the ones that see this final upheaval, these things happen, which was not the destruction of the temple in his day, or a generation after, but the end time destruction of the temple, that there'll be a rebuilt third temple, that'll be destroyed. When you see this happen, know that the coming of Messiah is near. That could be an interpretation as well. But I have no problem whatsoever with saying that he's first talking about the destruction of the temple, these things. When you see this, it's going to happen in your day. And there's going to be judgment, the Son of Man bringing judgment, and you'll see it happen in your day. And now separately, his end time return, no one knows the day or the hour. You say, yeah, but hang on. He said every stone would be undone, no stone left on another. And here we've got this remnant of the outside wall of the temple complex. You know, it's wild to think of this. He spoke of the horrific suffering that would happen to our people, and it happened. He warned about it. He wept over it as he was on his way to be crucified, and women were weeping. He said, don't weep for me, weep for what's coming on your city, weep for what's coming on your people. And one of the most striking things, even though the stones of the temple were absolutely massive, it was an architectural wonder that they were put together the way they were and how they were brought in and all of this. The Romans raised the city. They flattened the city. They flattened the temple. Raised, R-A-Z-E-D. They raised it. They flattened it. One of the things that Yeshua spoke of so accurately that people say, they made it up after. He didn't really say it. They made it up afterwards. No, these are things he declared in advance, and they happened strikingly. One of my colleagues said, could you imagine, as the city is destroyed, as thousands or hundreds of thousands of Jews are dying and thousands of Jews are being crucified, and there's terrible, terrible suffering in the city, and the temple itself flattened, and Jerusalem flattened all around, that someone says, look, there's some stones on top of each other. He's a false prophet. What a ridiculous scenario. In point of fact, when you look at prophetic language in the Hebrew Scriptures, when you look at how the prophets spoke about the destruction of Judea through the Babylonians, they spoke of it in broad terms, in sweeping terms of what was going to happen throughout all the cities, and it only happened in some of the cities, and it didn't happen exactly as they said, and even in the worst of the cities, it was more or less snapshots that they gave you of destruction and what would be called prophetic hyperbole. If we said some tragedy happens in a certain country, this country is going to be decimated and wiped out, every family affected, and everyone's going to lose loved ones. And then the tsunami hits, the terrible tsunami we had a few years ago. Someone might say, well, it was every single family, did each one, or you could say, wow, it happened as prophesied. Actually, one of the great proofs that we have of Yeshua's accuracy as a prophet is the way he spoke of the destruction of Jerusalem. If we can in fact demonstrate that the prophecies were spoken and written before the temple was destroyed and Jerusalem was destroyed, all the more do we look to him as a trustworthy prophet. There are other attacks on Jesus, Yeshua, in the New Testament. Let's just say they're more minor, and I'm not going to get into all of those, but I want to tackle a few more things. One argument is that the teachings of the New Testament may have started out Jewish, but before long they became totally pagan. This was done intentionally since the Jews rejected Yeshua as Messiah and only the pagans would listen to the message. Well, actually, the New Testament itself records that by the time of Acts 21, there were tens of thousands of Jews living in Jerusalem who believed in Yeshua and were zealous for the Torah. Tens of thousands. So we have that account. We also have the fact that Matthew, one of the four Gospels, is clearly written for Jewish believers. It's written to reach Jewish people with the good news of Messiah, but it's primarily written as a discipleship manual for Jewish believers. And it's clear that the Yeshua of Matthew is not tearing down Torah, but bringing it to fulfillment. And then what's also clear is we have the letter of Jacob, clearly written to Jewish believers and clearly talking to them about obeying Torah in the life of the Spirit. So to say it's un-Jewish or becomes pagan is absolutely contrary to the text. I mean, the book of Revelation, which we have as the last book of the New Testament, actually pictures the city of God that comes down from above. It's the New Jerusalem. And the 12 pillars of the city are the names of the 12 Jewish apostles, emissaries. And then the 12 gates are the names of the 12 tribes. It hardly stops being Jewish at the end. And the Messiah is known as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And even at the end, he's the descendant of David. Even at the end of Revelation. What you have is Paul writing letters to Gentile believers. What you have is Paul addressing Gentile believers who had no previous connection with Torah law and no previous connection with Israel, except those that would have been God-fearing Gentiles that attended synagogue services before. And even in that context, 1 Corinthians 5, Paul writes to the Corinthians about Passover, understanding that they know what Passover is, and then makes reference to first fruits in 1 Corinthians 15. And then we'll talk about, say, in Romans 15, how the Gentile believers have a debt to help the Jewish believers in Jerusalem financially. And Paul, when he traveled to the Gentile congregations, was often raising money to help the Jewish believers in Jerusalem because they suffered from more poverty and hardship. It hardly becomes pagan. The pagans are called to turn from their paganism and turn from their idolatry. Instead, what you have is now Paul communicating the values of the one true God to Gentiles who were not obligated to keep all of the Torah of Moses and who were not familiar with all the Torah of Moses. You say, yeah, but I mean, the New Testament institutes Easter and Christmas. No, it doesn't. It doesn't even mention them. None of those things were heard of. I see in the King James Bible, in Acts 12, it mentions Easter. It's a mistranslation. Greek is Pascha, the Passover. It's a mistranslation, all that is. So in point of fact, there's nothing pagan in the New Testament. You say, well, what about the myth of a dying, rising God? That has nothing to do with the Messiah, the righteous Messiah who takes on himself the sins of the world as a vicarious sacrifice, dies and rises from the dead in accordance with the prophecies of the Scriptures. No connection between the dying, rising God. And as we saw earlier, there's no connection with the so-called virgin birth, pagan God myth. No connection whatsoever with that and Yeshua's birth. Some have said, yeah. I mean, Jesus was really all right. Jesus was okay. In fact, my book, The Real Kosher Jesus, I wrote to respond to my friend Rabbi Shmuley, who wrote a book called Kosher Jesus. Rabbi Shmuley said, yeah, Jesus was a great rabbi. He was a great teacher. He was a loyal Jew. In fact, Rabbi Shmuley thinks he was a freedom fighter who died fighting against Rome. Of course, it's an unlikely scenario. He's got 11 disciples with 3 swords, and they're going to bring down Rome, but that's another story. Jesus was all right. He was a good Jew, fine rabbi. It was Paul who messed everything up and founded Christianity. Of course, what I find funny is the fact that out of one breath, Yeshua is being attacked as being un-Jewish and dangerous. Now, the other breath, well, he was fine. It's Paul. That's the problem. Actually, when you look at it in depth, you find that Paul carries out the message of Yeshua, and that Paul is in harmony with the message of Yeshua. And when you look at what Paul taught and then go back and see what Yeshua taught, you see, these actually line up. And his beliefs about Yeshua's death and resurrection and return are in keeping with what the other writers in the New Testament say as well. In point of fact, the book of Acts tells us that Paul continued to live as an observant Jew. He continued to live as a religious Jew. When he was reaching Gentiles with the good news of the Messiah, is it possible in order to reach people that had never heard the message, he would eat something that he wouldn't normally have eaten? It could well be. And he would have said that's a principle now, that the most important thing is to bring the message of the one true God to the nations. We don't know that he did that, but you can argue that he may have based on some passages, or we can reconstruct that potentially. But the fact of the matter was, otherwise, he lived as a Jew. Why? Because he was a Jew. And the Messiah coming didn't mean you stopped being Jewish, and it didn't mean you threw out Torah. What it meant was now you live it out through the life of the Spirit. You see, there are only 2 ways to go, basically. Well, let's say 3 ways. You have the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. You either say, okay, we don't understand exactly how to keep all the laws, and God gives us traditions and understanding and interpretations, and that grows and grows and grows and grows and grows until we have Talmud, we have the law codes, we have the responsa literature, we have the ongoing rabbinic traditions and so-called Yam HaTalmud, the sea of the Talmud, and on and on and on. You either have that, so you have rabbinic Judaism, or you have what the Karaites did. They rejected the rabbinic traditions. There's a handful of Karaites that still remain today, but numbered in the thousands. They rejected what the rabbis said and went back to the text, and they said, hey, this is the way it's always been. These rabbis added things on without authority. We just go back to the biblical text and use the biblical text to draw our interpretation. But then even out of that, then they develop their traditions. Or you say, and we'll pick up with this in the next class, or you say, most of what's written in the Torah we can't do today. We don't have a temple standing. We don't have blood sacrifices. We don't have a functioning priesthood. We don't even have a religious rule at that kind of sovereignty in the land of Israel to fully carry everything out. And for most of our history, then, we haven't been able to do these. Is it possible there's a better way? Plus, we don't put adulterers to death now. We don't burn witches. We don't do those things that Torah law commanded. We don't practice levirate marriage, in other words, polygamy, under any circumstances. So could it be that these laws were spoken and were utterly true and were for the people, but that was not the end? The end was the coming of the Messiah, or I should say the goal was the coming of the Messiah, Greek telos, which can mean end or goal, that it all functioned to bring us to Messiah. Now that Messiah has come, he brings us into a new and better covenant and takes the life-giving principles of the Torah and writes them in our hearts, so that as we love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love our neighbors ourselves, we will now carry out the righteous requirements of the law. In other words, Messiah points us to a new and better way. It's not anti-Torah, it's not contrary to the Torah, rather it's building on what the Torah taught and shows us the Torah is pointing to the coming of Messiah in the world. Now he gives the Spirit. Now we can live these things out in a new and better way, including Sabbath, including the meaning of the biblical calendar, including holiness principles. He empowers us to live them out in a new and better way. So we want to look at Yeshua and the law, Paul and the law, and then in our very last lecture, we'll look at a response to the idea that there's been an unbroken chain of tradition going all the way back to Moses at Mount Sinai. All right, let's focus in on the question of Yeshua and the law. Did he abolish the law? Now, some Christians would say, yeah, he did. He made an end to the law, and that's no problem because now we have Christianity. Well, it's a big problem if you're a Jewish person, because one way that you could distinguish a false prophet from a true prophet, or by extension, a false Messiah from a true Messiah, was their relationship to Torah. In other words, if someone comes along according to Deuteronomy 13 and says, okay, let's follow other gods, trash this, break all the commandments, follow other gods, trash this, and work signs, wonders, and miracles, you're just being tested. Reject them. That's why Yeshua says in Matthew 5, beginning of verse 17, don't think I came to abolish the law of the prophets, but to fulfill. And then he goes on to say that until heaven and earth pass away, not one tiny little stroke of the law will pass until everything is fulfilled. And then he goes on to say, whoever keeps the least of these commandments will be great in the kingdom. Whoever breaks them, teaches others to do the same, will be the least. And your righteousness must surpass that of the scribes and the Pharisees, Matthew 5, 17 to 20. Let me explain how Yeshua relates to Torah. First, if you will go through all of the commandments, and I do this, I do it for you, do the work for you in volume 4 of Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus, but go through all the commandments that are forever, for all generations, and so on. If you will go through those, you will see that about 75% of the forever commandments have to do with commandments that we could only keep with a temple standing, functioning priesthood, and Jewish sovereignty in the land. In other words, through most of Israelite history and through most of Jewish history, we have been unable to keep 75% of the forever commandments. In fact, from within one generation after Yeshua until today, we have been unable to keep 75% of the forever commandments. If you will actually go through the Torah starting in Exodus 12, which is the very beginning of chapters dealing with giving of law, with Passover, and then in particular, Exodus 20 and thereafter, and look at all of the legal chapters, all the chapters dealing with commandments, laws, etc. You'll find there roughly 75%. The vast, vast majority of the content there cannot be observed without a functioning priesthood, standing temple, and Jewish sovereignty in the land. Now, Yeshua prophesied that this was going to be destroyed, the temple was going to be destroyed, and we'd be exiled and suffer terribly. And he prophesied and said that his death was the beginning of the new covenant. He was inaugurating the new covenant with his body and with his blood. And that this was now going to bring a new and better covenant that Jeremiah prophesied in Jeremiah 31 with the Torah of God being put in our hearts. Does it mean the same Torah? This means the teaching of the Lord. Could be the same 5 books, could be other things, but the principles, the teaching of the Lord would now be put in our hearts, and we'd be supernaturally empowered to keep these things. And there'd be a once-for-all forgiveness of sins instead of annual sacrifices, annual sacrifices, annual sacrifices. So, what does he tell us? To summarize for you, he takes everything having to do with approach to God, namely sacrifice, offering, temple, priesthood, blood, and he himself becomes our great high priest. He himself becomes the ultimate sacrifice, the atoning power, the death of the righteous. And in himself, all these things we can't fulfill anymore, he now does and brings to completion. He brings to completion what the animal sacrifices were pointing to, what the priestly ministry was pointing to. He brings it to completion. Now, let me take this a little further. He takes the moral commandments of the Torah and takes them to a deeper ethic. You've heard, don't commit adultery. I'm telling you, don't commit adultery even in your heart. He takes them to a higher level, and then he illustrates how we are to live in this new covenant life, how we are to live now empowered by the Spirit. Now, here's something very interesting. Matthew 5:17, he says, I didn't come to abolish the law or the prophets. It's unusual to have those two phrases together in the New Testament. In fact, elsewhere in Matthew, it only occurs a couple of times. He says, I didn't come to abolish the law or the prophets. And then in Matthew 7:12, he makes reference to this sums up the law and the prophets. Do to others as you would have them do to you. This sums up the law and the prophets. What's the point? Let me explain. From what we can see of ancient Jewish sermons, there was a certain structure. You had an introduction or a prologue. Then you had the heart of the sermon. Then you had the concluding exhortations. I see the exact same thing in the Sermon on the Mount, as do other scholars. Matthew 5:3 through 16 is the prologue, the introduction. Blessed, truly happy are the poor in spirit, are the meek, and so on. This is the introduction. You're the salt of the earth. You're the light of the world. Now, the heart of the sermon. Matthew 5:17 to 7:12. Begins with law of the prophets, ends with law and the prophets. All right, so this is the parenthesis on either side, if you want, saying this is the body of it, right here in the middle. This is the body of it. This is my main sermon. What's he saying? This is how you live it out. Whoever obeys the least of these commandments, whoever breaks the least of these commandments. Which commandments? The commandments he's now going to give, which articulate kingdom living, which articulate how to live in the newness of the Spirit. So ultimately, when there is no temple standing, where there are no blood sacrifices, when none of these things can be kept anymore, we can live them out. Do you see it? So 5:17 to 7:12, that's the body of the Sermon on the Mount. That's why he sums up in verse 12 of Matthew 7 saying, therefore, do to others as you would have them do to you. This sums up the law and the prophets. Why is there a therefore? The previous verses 7 through 11 don't seem to lead into that. Ask and it shall be given you, seek and you shall find, knock and the door shall be opened. For everyone who asks receives, he who seeks finds, to him who knocks the door is open. What man is there of you, if his son asks for bread, will give him a stone. If he asks for fish, we'll give him a snake. Instead, if you being evil know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your heavenly Father give good things to those who ask him? And then, therefore, where's the therefore come? He's now summing up. Okay, I've taught this. I've laid this out. This is kingdom life. This is the Messianic way. This is the higher life I'm calling you to. This is life in the Spirit. This is life empowered by humbling yourselves and being blessed and strengthened by God. And then he goes on from verse 13 to the end of the chapter with his closing exhortation. Beware of false prophets. Strive to enter into the straight gate. Build your house on the rock of obedience to my words. You see, he's saying this is how you live it out. So he knew that the vast majority of the laws we wouldn't be able to keep. He knew that there would be this disruption. And rather than leave us without a temple and without a sacrifice, without a priesthood, he brought that to fulfillment in his own life. He fulfills the biblical calendars we saw in previous classes, his death corresponding to Passover, his resurrection, first fruits, the giving of the Spirit, Shavuot, Pentecost, and then what we still await, his return with the blast of the shofar, Yom Teruah, which becomes Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish calendar, and then Yom Kippur, national cleansing for Israel after he returns, and then all the nations coming into Jerusalem to celebrate Sukkot, tabernacles. He's the fulfillment of the biblical calendar, that which has been and that which is yet to be. And then there's more. There's more. Sabbath. There are many, many Messianic Jews I know, and they observe the Sabbath. They love the Sabbath. As I record this now on a Friday afternoon, I spoke with a Messianic Jewish leader a few hours ago, and he wished me Shabbat Shalom. That's lifestyle for him. He wasn't doing that because he's trying to win a Jew to Jesus. He's going to put on the show and make believe he's Jewish. No, he loves the Sabbath, and God gave it, and Yeshua never rescinded it. But I want to show you that it goes beyond that. Matthew chapter 11, beginning verse 28, Yeshua says, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Learn of me. Take my yoke upon you. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. Find out who I am. Emulate me. You'll find rest for your souls. Rest, the operative word there. Now that goes straight into Matthew 12. And in Matthew 12, there are disputes about Sabbath observance. And Yeshua is pointing to a better way and saying you're caught up with minutia. You're caught up with a certain system. There's more to it. I'm showing you a better way. And ultimately, I am the Sabbath rest you're looking for. You find it in me. The Messiah embodies it. Now, it doesn't mean that we become lawless. What it means is we now see what the scriptures were pointing to, what God's intent was. So yes, you can observe a seventh-day Sabbath, but it's no death penalty for not observing it, because the goal is ultimately to find rest in Messiah. And those that have it on their hearts to observe the seventh-day Sabbath, they do. They don't divide over it from other brothers and sisters. If they're church friends that celebrate the resurrection of Messiah on Sunday and meet them, we don't divide over these things, because our ultimate rest is found in him. So Yeshua does not abolish the Torah. He gives us the Messianic way to live it out in newness of life in the Spirit. Again, we could get into more depth in that. I'm sure you have other classes, New Testament classes, theology classes that will get into more depth in that. And I get into more depth in my book. What about Paul abolishing the law? There are many passages, or a good number of passages in his teachings, that seem to speak of the end of the Torah. Romans 10:4, Christ is the end of the Torah for all who believe. Or Ephesians 2, that he has abolished the commandments. Or Romans 6, we're not under law, we're under grace. Is Paul advocating the abolition of Torah? Certainly not. Certainly not. Number one, we see in the book of Acts, as I mentioned in the last lecture, we see in the book of Acts that he himself continued to live as a Torah-observant Jew. In the life of the Spirit, not bound by human tradition, in the life of the Spirit. He articulates that in 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter, that his ultimate law was the law of the Messiah and God that he followed. But he continues to live as a Jew. He preaches in the synagogues. How do you get in the synagogue if you're obviously not a Jew and known to be not a Jew or not living as a Jew? How do you get in the synagogues and have a dialogue with the Jewish leaders? Because he was living as a Jew. And he appeals to that even at a trial. Even in Acts, the 23rd chapter, he says, I'm a Pharisee. Yeah, it's still the group that I identify with in terms of Jewish groups, even though I'm a follower of Yeshua and a follower of the way, as it was called. So there are passages that could sound easily as if he's saying this is the abolition of the law. Of course, it would put him in conflict with Jesus, which raises the question, how come there were Jewish followers of Yeshua that recognized Paul? For example, the Nazarenes, as they were called, they followed the teachings of Yeshua, recognized him as the divine Messiah, rejected the rabbinic traditions that were developing, and believed that Paul was a true apostle. So obviously, people did not always find contradiction here. And the book of Acts tells us there is no contradiction because Paul himself lives as a Jew. Here's what we need to understand when we read the writings of Paul. And the New Testament tells us itself in 2 Peter 3 that some of his writings are hard to understand and people have misinterpreted them. If it's hard to understand, it can't be from the Lord. Do you really believe that if you're a religious Jew? You've ever learned Talmud? Of course not. Sometimes the difficulty of it is the reward itself, that you have to dig deeper and pray more and think more and compare more what's being said. Number one, we need to understand that Paul was primarily writing to Gentiles. So, for example, when he wrote to the Galatians, these were Gentiles living in Galatia. There were other followers of Jesus who came and taught. They were Jewish followers of Yeshua, but they had departed from the real gospel message, and they were telling Gentiles, you must be circumcised and obey the law of Moses in order to be saved. You must be circumcised and obey the law of Moses in order to be saved. And Paul said, no, if you do that, then you've fallen from grace. You're no longer just receiving God's mercy and grace and favor. No, you're now saying you've got to keep every... No, that's not why the Messiah came. The Messiah did not come to make Gentiles into Jews. He came to make a way for Jew and Gentile to be forgiven of sin and come into new life in him. So Paul is combating that. And when he is combating things in the midst of that letter, he's not telling Jews don't live as Jews. That was never the dispute. Jews lived as Jews. In fact, he writes in 1 Corinthians 7, if you came to faith in Messiah, you were circumcised, don't become uncircumcised. If you're uncircumcised, don't become circumcised. If you come to faith as a Jew, don't become a Gentile. You come to faith as a Gentile, don't become a Jew. So, first thing we've got to recognize is that he was writing to Gentile believers, and he was not instructing Jewish believers about what to do and what not to do. That's the first thing. The second thing, he understood the law in a sense to be like scaffolding for a building. Scaffolding for building. That scaffolding is necessary when the building is being erected, but once it's built and it's standing on its own, you take the scaffolding down. He understood that the purpose of Torah was to bring us to the Messiah. Hence, Romans 10:4 uses the Greek word telos. Most English translations will say Christ, Messiah is the end of the law, but it could just as readily be translated the goal to which the Torah prophesies, or the Torah points, the goal to which it's going is Yeshua the Messiah. So, when he speaks in this way, Galatians, the 3rd chapter, he explains that the law, the Torah, was a pedagogue, a tutor, to bring us to the Messiah. Let me explain. In the ancient world in which Paul lived, the ancient Greek world, he was a Jew who was a Greek citizen. You would have a household servant or slave, and the job of that slave would be to take children back and forth to school and oversee their mentoring and their education. In other words, not the teacher, but the pedagogue, the one that would be responsible for making sure they're getting trained and taught and cared for back and forth and so on, watched over. Well, Paul says that's what the law did for Israel. I use the analogy of scaffolding to say this was to keep Israel understanding who God is, what his laws are, what his requirements are, what his holiness is about, who the Messiah will be, to keep them on this path. Now that Messiah comes, now the building is completed, we don't need the scaffolding, we don't need the pedagogue anymore. Now the fullness has come, that which the Torah was pointing towards, and now God writes his righteous principles on our hearts. And for Gentiles, that's all that was ever required. God never required Gentiles to keep all of the law of Moses. When he says we're not under law, we're under grace, what he means is we're no longer under a system that we cannot live up to on our own. We're no longer under the law's condemnation. We're no longer under the law as a tutor or pedagogue. And we're no longer under the law as a system of righteousness and justification, because we see from the history of Israel in the Hebrew Scriptures that we fell short over and over and over and over and over and over again. And then from our near 2,000-year exile from the land that we've been falling short over and over again. Otherwise, we would have been fully restored and the glory of God covering the earth a long time ago. He recognizes that based on the system of law, it brings condemnation and judgment. That, as he says in Romans 7:12, that the law, the commandment are holy and just and good, but they show us our sin. So he writes in Romans 3 that no one's going to be justified by the law. Yeah, here it is, do it, live it out, and yet we all fall short, which then condemns us. You say, doesn't that abolish the law? No, he said it establishes it. Romans 3, because it's the law itself that tells us in Genesis 15 in the Torah that we're justified by faith. And that we need, according to Deuteronomy, a new heart. Where does that new heart come from? We can't get it on our own. We need God to grant it. That's what happens when the Messiah comes and we receive a new heart and a new spirit. Paul was also against anything that put a wall up between believers or anything that smacked of racial or ethnic or spiritual pride. So think of this for a moment. And by the way, the subject of Paul and the law is complex. I've meditated on it, studied it for decades, as many others have. I am not a scholar of Paul. I am a student of Paul for decades and involved in the scholarly literature. But there is a massive debate from every angle within the church, within the Jewish community, within the Messianic Jewish community. I'm simply laying out principles as best as I understand it and as simply as I can put these things. But let's understand that in Paul's vision, the Messianic era had broken in. The Messianic era had broken in, and Paul saw in the prophetic scriptures, Paul saw in Deuteronomy and the Psalms and other passages in Isaiah that in the Messianic era, or in a future time, that the Gentiles would serve God alongside of Israel. The Gentiles would serve God together with the Jewish people. And he realized, wait, Messiah has come. Messiah has come. And now in Messiah's family, the two become one without losing their distinctives. Now, when a Jewish man wakes up in the morning, what's one of the first prayers he prays? he prays a prayer of thanksgiving. And he thanks God for three things. What? He thanks God that he's not a woman. He thanks God that he's not a Gentile. He thanks God that he's not a slave. Now, looking at that from the outside, that seems extremely arrogant, especially if you are a woman or a Gentile or a slave. A traditional Jew thinks like this. A woman, because of certain things that she will experience on a monthly basis or things that could be related to childbearing, childbirth, child rearing, and things like that in her monthly cycle, there are certain commandments from which she is exempt because she cannot keep them because of certain other physical issues that she may have that could render her unclean and so on. So there are certain time-related commandments that a woman is free from. Therefore, a Jewish woman is not obligated to keep every single commandment that a Jewish man would be obligated to keep. What about a Gentile? Well, of course, a Gentile was never given the entire Torah to keep. So a Gentile would not be required to keep the entire Torah. What about a slave? Well, the slave can't because they're under someone else's control, and that other person may make them work on the Sabbath or only feed them food that's non-kosher or whatever, and they have no control over the matter. They want to go and offer sacrifice, but they can't because they're someone's slave. So who is it, the only one, who is required to keep all of the commandments through Jewish eyes? A free Jewish male. Not a slave, not a Gentile, not a woman. Are you getting it? What does Paul write to the Galatians, to the Colossians? That in Messiah, in Yeshua, there is neither, what? Jew or Gentile, Jew or Greek, circumcised or uncircumcised. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female. Now, elsewhere in his letters, he addresses masters and he addresses slaves, so he knows they still exist. Elsewhere in his letters, he addresses men with certain teaching and women with other teaching, so he knows they exist and he makes distinctions. But what he's saying there, and it could well be that this Jewish tradition existed already in his day, of saying, I thank God I'm not a woman, I'm not a slave, I'm not a Gentile. And Paul says in Messiah, there's no male or female, there's no slave or free, there's no Jew or Gentile. What he means is we all stand equally before God. What he means is in Yeshua, there is no caste system, there is no class system. That we all have access to God through Yeshua, that we all can stand in his presence as spiritual priests in a spiritual temple that he has now built and offer up spiritual sacrifices of praise and adoration. And there's no distinction, and we are all called to obey him fully. He's not saying that in God's sight there's no difference between a Jew or a Gentile, a man or a woman, or a slave or a free person in terms of different abilities, different callings, things a woman can do that a man can't, and vice versa. Things that he's given to Gentiles, things that he's given to Jews. Our unity is found in our diversity. Our unity is found in our distinctives. Just like you listen to an orchestra and has all the different instruments, each playing their part, our diversity, our distinctives bring unity. So today you have a Messianic congregation worshiping on Shabbat, on the seventh-day Sabbath. And they may share a building with a church. And that church meets on Sunday morning and celebrates the resurrection of Jesus. And they're one in Yeshua. And the Jewish believers may say, you know, just to be in solidarity with our people, we don't eat shellfish, we don't eat bacon, pork, and that's just to be in solidarity with our people. We know it doesn't internally defile us. We understand those principles of Yeshua. Those things don't internally defile us. In that sense, foods are clean, but we choose to not eat certain things. But we've got no problem whatsoever with our Gentile friends eating bacon. It doesn't matter to us. In other words, each group can have their distinctives. You can have your men's, women's, you can have men's meetings and your women's meetings in your congregations. That's fine. Men can have certain leadership roles, women other ministry functions. That's fine. But Paul's saying there is no barrier that separates us anymore. Ephesians 2, the middle wall of partition has come down. So in that sense, the commandments that would divide us have come down so that we can have unity in Messiah. And we know in the temple in Jerusalem in Yeshua's day that there was that wall. No woman can go beyond here. No Gentile can go beyond here. In Yeshua, that wall comes down. We have equal access to God. It doesn't mean the law is abolished. It means it now comes into its fullest expression and meaning in the Messianic era. And it also means that it may be on the hearts of Jews to live a certain way and Gentiles to live a certain way, but we do this as one body without ethnic or racial or spiritual separation, and we find unity in our diversity. The last lecture, I want to look at the question of Jewish tradition and why we reject the idea that there's an unbroken chain of tradition going all the way back to Moses on Mount Sinai.